Welcome back, brothers and heretics, to Grimhammer. Tonight we're diving into the lore of the Death Korps. Before we get into the madness, be sure to like, comment any videos and topics in the scene in the future. Be sure to subscribe from the Emperor or other dark gods. I don't think you guys to support. I've been killing it like always. Let's get to the madness.
Beneath Krieg, the dead world breathed. It breathed through rusted vents and corpse narrow ducts, through cathedral pipes buried under mountains of black stone, through the lungs of men who had never seen an unpoisoned sky. Its breath was warm, recycled, and bitter with old metal. It tasted of sweat sealed inside rubber masks, of weapon oil rubbed into sacred mechanisms, of rad dust that had found its way through every gate, every filter, every prayer, and every generation since the world had learned the price of treachery. The muster vault ran for miles beneath the surface, a cavern of ferrocrete pillars and armoured galleries descending into darkness. Moisture dripped from the ceiling in slow, patient beads. Each drop struck helmets, greatcoats, lasgun casings, ammunition crates, coffin lids, and the bowed backs of servitors hauling shells toward freight elevators large enough to swallow tanks. Thousands of corpsmen stood in ranks upon the black iron deck. They did not murmur. They did not shift their weight. They did not cough, even though the air was sour and the filters in their rebreathers clicked softly with every draw of breath. Their masks gave them all the same face. Round lenses, long snouts, blank obedience. There were no smiles beneath those masks that mattered, no fear that mattered, no memories that mattered beyond the one memory the world had beaten into them before they could speak. Krieg had betrayed, Krieg had burned, Krieg had atoned. From the loudspeakers high above, a voice of iron and static recited the old catechism. By rebellion we were damned, by fire we were judged. By obedience we endure, by death we repay. No man answered. Silence was the proper reply. The vault absorbed the words, swallowed them, and gave them back as a tremor through the boots of the assembled regiments. There had been a time when Krieg possessed cities open to the sky. There had been high spires and manufactoria, noble houses and planetary armies, proud banners and men who spoke of self-rule, as if loyalty were a garment to be removed when it grew uncomfortable. They had turned from terror, they had turned from the Emperor. They had crowned their own vanity and named it freedom. Colonel Jerton had answered them. The loyalist commander had not pleaded with traitors. He had not bargained with governors, merchant princes, militia lords, or the soft-tongued cowards who always discovered principles after tasting power. He had opened the hidden vaults. He had armed the atomic stockpiles. He had looked upon a world diseased by treason and chosen surgery with fire. The purging had come down like the judgment of a murdered god. Cities became suns, oceans boiled into poisoned vapor. The sky turned black, then red, then black again. The rebel palaces ran molten through their own foundations. Men who had shouted against the throne became shadows burned into stone. The loyal died with the guilty. The innocent, if such a thing still existed on a rebel world, died with the damned. Krieg did not remember this as tragedy. Krieg remembered it as clarity. A world that could betray deserved no gentler lesson. The war had not ended in the atomic dawn. It had gone on beneath the ash, inside tunnels, bunker cities, ration vaults, corpse farms, and Militarum tombs. 500 years of loyalist war followed the fire. 500 years of sons born to die in tunnels their fathers had died digging. 500 years of bayonets in the dark, of filters changed over the bodies of brothers, of ammunition counted with more care than blood. 500 years until the last traitor stronghold fell, until the last rebel banner was dragged through irradiated mud, until the survivors of Krieg presented themselves to the Imperium not as citizens, not as victims, but as debtors. They had owed the Emperor a world. They would repay him with soldiers. The voice from the speakers continued. You were not born. You were issued. You were not raised. You were prepared. You possess no wound that absolves you. You possess no fear that excuses you. You possess no life that belongs to you. At the forward end of the muster vault, under a hanging aquila of blackened iron, the new intake stood apart from the veteran formations. Their greatcoats were stiff. Their masks were newly stamped. Their hands rested on the stocks of their Lucius pattern number 98 lasguns with the caution of men who had been taught reverence. Through pain. They had endured the hypnovaults first, for months, perhaps years, depending on Militarum requirement and survival yield. They had lain in rows beneath flickering lumen strips while machine voices poured doctrine into their skulls. They learned the proper weight of a lasgun by dream and shock. They learned the sound of an incoming shell before waking. They learned that retreat was not movement away from death, but movement away from duty, and therefore treason. They learned the shape of Krieg's sin. They learned to despise comfort as a parasite of weakness. After that came the tunnel drills. Beneath the training warrens, they crawled through pipes filled with ash slurry and razor wire. They advanced through mock trenches where combat servitors waited in the dark with spinning blades, shock mauls, rusted cleavers, and old mining saws. The servitors did not slow for recruits. The medici did not rush to save the fallen. A trainee who lost fingers learned to reload with what remained. A trainee who lost nerve was dragged aside, marked with chalk, and processed as unworthy expenditure. The gas mask endurance rites killed more. The recruits were sealed inside pressure chambers where poison fog was pumped in until the air turned yellow. They stood in full kit, respirators locked, filters timed, while instructors watched through armored glass. Some panicked when their breath grew hot and wet inside the mask. Some clawed at the straps. Some fell and convulsed, heels hammering against the deck. The survivors were not congratulated. Survival was not achievement. It was permission to continue serving. The final trials took place upon the surface. There, under the Korps sky of Krieg, the recruits marched across wastes where the ground still clicked on rad counters and the wind carried powdered bone from battlefields older than their bloodlines. The sun was a dim wound behind cloud banks of industrial soot. Training mines lifted men in pieces. Servo turrets tracked movement through dust storms. Old trenches, some real and some built for instruction, became killing schools where the recruit learned that mud could drown a man, wire could hold him upright after death, and a bayonet was most useful when the enemy's face was close enough to fog one's lenses. Failure was not mourned. The world produced more. 50 million soldiers a year, the tithe masters said. Sometimes more. Never enough. The Imperium was a furnace, and Krieg had become a shovel feeding it bodies shaped like men. Among the assembled veterans of the 317th Siege Regiment stood Watchmaster 44th Alpha, known in the platoon records by the trench name Cord. He had not chosen it. Someone had called him that after a bombardment on a nameless moon where half the platoon had been buried alive and the other half had dug forward instead of back. The name had remained because no officer had found it inefficient. Cord stood motionless in the third rank of second platoon, gloved hands moving only when necessary. He checked the alignment of his bayonet by touch, thumb pressing against the locking ring until it clicked into place beneath the barrel of his lasgun. He counted the power packs on his harness. He checked the seals of his rebreather, the spare filters in their tin case, the water pipe clipped against his chest, the entrenching tools strapped to his pack, the frag grenades, the crack grenades, the ration tins, the rolled ground sheet, the wire cutters, the spare charge cell wrapped in oilcloth. Everything ugly, everything durable, everything sacred because it functioned. A recruit beside him breathed too quickly. Cord heard it through the mask grill, a wet flutter against rubber and fear. The recruit whispered, barely audible under the loudspeakers, "I will survive this." Cord turned his lenses upon him. The recruit stiffened. "You will serve this," Cord said. The correction was quiet. It carried no anger. Anger implied expectation. Expectation implied personal concern. Cord had neither. The recruit bowed his masked head. "I will serve." Cord faced forward again. A tremor moved through the vault as freight elevators descended from the upper armory levels. Chains clanked, hydraulic pistons screamed. Servitors with flayed skulls and brass jaw clamps dragged ammunition pallets between the ranks. Shells for Earthshaker guns rolled past in iron cradles, each one painted with devotional script, by hands that would never touch the battlefield. Heavy mortar rounds followed, crates of las packs, boxes of bayonet blades, filter drums, coffin tags, body bags, more shells, always more shells. At the far end of the vault, a command dais rose from the deck. Colonel Adrast Holm stepped onto it without ceremony. He wore the same mask as his men, though his greatcoat bore the iron skull and campaign bars of command. His breastplate was scratched by shrapnel and acid rain. His gloved right hand rested on the hilt of a chainsword that looked as plain and brutal as a trench spade. Behind him stood officers, vox adjutants, a pair of priests in soot-black vestments, and a commissar newly attached to the regiment. The commissar's coat was too clean. His eyes, visible beneath the brim of his cap, moved across the silent ranks, as if searching for something human enough to understand. Holm waited until the loudspeakers died. The silence that followed was immense. "You are not sons," the colonel said. His voice emerged through the mask grill, flat and metallic. "You are not heroes. You are a debt given shape. You will be spent correctly." No cheer answered him. He continued. "The Imperium does not require your hope. Hope is a ration for worlds not yet tested. The Imperium does not require your courage. Courage presumes fear has relevance. The Imperium requires obedience, endurance, and death delivered in useful measure. You will provide these things." Cord listened. So did the regiment. If any man felt pride, it remained hidden behind glass lenses and rubber seals. Pride was another luxury of the unbombed. Holm raised one hand. A hololithic projection shuddered into life above the dais, green and sickly in the vault gloom. A planet appeared, rotating slowly, banded by orbital markers and red threat sigils. "Hyrcan Secundus," said Holm. "Armory world, Manufactorum grade, Prometheum reserves sufficient for crusade-scale operations, macro shell vaults, tank foundries, orbital defense batteries. Current status, rebellion." The word moved through the vault like a blade drawn across bone. Rebellion. The oldest filth. The first sin of Krieg. The wound that never closed. A vox adjutant stepped forward and read from a parchment strip stamped with Militarum seals. Astropathic confirmation received through sanctioned choir. Planetary command compromised. Governor dead. Ecclesiastical authority corrupted. Foundry guilds divided. Orbital grid hostile. Estimated enemy material export, if unopposed, sufficient to destabilize 3 subsectors. Imperial response authorized. Siege army deployment sanctioned. Reclamation priority absolute. The hololith flickered, showing hive cities, trench belts, armory vaults, rail lines, macro cannon emplacements, Prometheum seas, and the great black wound of Hive Morn. Cord studied the projection without curiosity. A world had betrayed. The shape of the world did not matter. Its guilt did. A recruit in the forward intake rank raised his hand. Several veterans turned their lenses toward him. The commissar watched with interest. Colonel Holm gave the smallest inclination of his head. The recruit spoke carefully. "Sir, are loyal civilians to be evacuated before bombardment?" No one moved. Somewhere in the vault, water dripped from the ceiling. Holm looked down at the recruit for several seconds. "If they are loyal," the colonel said, "they will endure until relieved. If they do not endure, loyalty was insufficient." The recruit lowered his hand. The lesson entered him. Perhaps it killed something. Perhaps it completed something. In Krieg, the distinction was academic. The muster order expanded before the hour ended. One regiment became a procession of regiments. Line corps marched from adjoining vaults, their boots striking the deck in the same dead rhythm. Bombardment corps followed, accompanied by gun crews and shell servitors. Combat engineers came with melter charges, wire spools, trench augers, demolition packs, and the blank stare of men more comfortable beneath ground than above it. Death Riders led their chemically hardened mounts through side tunnels, the beasts masked and armoured, hooves ringing against iron. Tank crews passed under banners of oil-stained canvas, while engineers clicked Binharic prayers over Lehman Russ battle tanks chained to grav haulers. Quartermaster cadres moved with corpse carts and medici servitors, their pistols already loaded for mercy. Priests carried censers that smoked with bitter incense and promethium fumes. Ammunition trains crawled like armoured worms toward the void elevators. Coffin vaults, stacked in endless rows, waited for the return journey with patient mouths. The 317th began to move. They marched from the muster vault into transit tunnels wide enough for super-heavy armour. Servo skulls drifted overhead, reading identity tags and recording respirator signatures. At each checkpoint, Militarum clerks stamped parchment without looking at the men they consigned to war. At each shrine, the corpsman passed beneath a skull, faced Aquila, and the words engraved below it. "Only in death does duty end." Cord did not look up. He had read the words enough times for them to become part of the inside of his skull. The void port lay beneath the northern crust, an armored wound in the planet's dead skin. Great elevators lifted the regiments through layers of blast doors and rad shield plates until gravity shifted and the air grew colder. Through reinforced viewing slits, the surface of Krieg appeared in brief, passing glimpses. Black plains, glassed craters, ruined bunker spines, lightning without rain, statues half buried in ash, their faces erased by centuries of poison wind. The troop ships waited in launch cradles, vast and lightless, their hulls marked with campaign scars and devotional litanies. They looked less like vessels than mausoleums given engines. Their boarding ramps opened with groans that rolled through the port like the awakening of buried giants. The corpsmen filed aboard. No farewell drums sounded, no families wept, no banners waved except those assigned by regulation. Krieg did not waste grief on men fulfilling their purpose. Inside the transport, Cord found his assigned berth in a compartment of iron racks and restraint harnesses. The air was colder than the vault. It smelled of machine oil, old blood, disinfectant, and the faint, sour reek of void-sealed humanity. He secured his lasgun above him, checked his grenades again, checked his filter case again, then stood with the others as the ship sealed its belly. Colonel Holmes' voice came over the internal vox. "You will deploy to Hyrcan Secundus. You will prosecute siege operations until resistance ends, or your capacity to serve is exhausted. You will not preserve yourselves. You will preserve the Emperor's claim. Remember Krieg. Remember the debt." The engines woke. The deck shuddered beneath Cord's boots. Around him, thousands of masked soldiers swayed as one and corrected their balance as one. The void transport rose through the launch shaft, past blast doors, past defense lasers, past the last layers of the dead world's skin. For a moment, Krieg filled the armored porthole beside him. It was small from above. A black sphere wrapped in storm bands and ash, scarred by old fire, still turning, still breathing through the tunnels of its buried suns. Cord watched it without sentiment. He had never loved Krieg. Love belonged to men with choices, but he understood it. Krieg was proof. Krieg was warning. Krieg was what remained when betrayal met sufficient punishment. The ship entered high orbit. Other transports burned beside it in formation, hundreds of them, their engine flares pale against the dark. Beyond them waited warships, fuel tenders, ammunition hulks, forge barges, coffin carriers, and the long iron silhouettes of vessels built to carry armies into death. Then the warp translation klaxons began to toll. The compartment lumen strips turned red. Restraints locked over shoulders and chests. Somewhere far forward, sanctioned machinery tore open a wound in reality, and the ship's Geller field began its sacred work. The air thickened. Men tasted copper through their filters. The shadows in the compartment stretched the wrong way. Cord kept his gaze on the porthole until Krieg blurred behind sheets of impossible color. A recruit across from him clenched his gloved hands around his harness. His breath hitched once, only once. Cord did not rebuke him. The warp was not fear. The warp was contamination given hunger. Disgust was permissible. The last sight of Krieg vanished. The void transport fell into madness with an army in its belly. Cord turned from the porthole and rested one hand on the casing of his lasgun. His thumb brushed the bayonet lug. His filter rasped softly. His world was gone behind them, but its lesson remained, sharper than steel and heavier than any oath. He spoke so quietly that only the mask heard him. A world that still breathes can still betray. The fleet tore itself out of the warp above Hyrcan Secundus with a scream of tortured reality. For a heartbeat, the void around the armory world became a wound. Sick colors bled across the stars, impossible and hungry, crawling along the hulls of troop ships and war barges before the Geller field steadied and the Immaterium spat the Krieg invasion force back into real space. Auspec's shrines shrieked. Astropaths bled from their noses behind locked doors. Servitors died at their posts with smoke leaking from their cranial sockets. Then the madness folded shut behind them, and ordinary war received them. Hyrcan Secundus burned below. The planet turned slowly beneath a crown of orbital fire. Its night side was veined with hive blazes, manufactorum infernos, and the furnace glow of cities murdering themselves. Hive spires rose through smoke banks like black teeth. Equatorial trench belts scarred the world in 3 vast rings, each one visible from orbit as a rust-colored wound encircling continents of ash waste, armor yards, Promethean basins, and gunmetal plains. The oceans were narrow and poisoned, slick with refinery waste and burning in places where the Promethean pipelines had ruptured into the shallows. Above it, the void battle had already begun. Imperial wreckage tumbled in silence. A troop transport drifted without power, split along its spine, its decks open to the stars and its cargo spilling out in glittering clouds of men, munitions, and frozen blood. A frigate burned from within, fire crawling behind armoured viewports as internal atmosphere fed the blaze room by room. Defence lasers from the planet's orbital grid stabbed upward in hard white beams, punching through escorts, void shields, and debris fields with the cold precision of machines that had forgotten their masters. The Krieg fleet did not scatter, it adjusted. Across command decks and troop holds, the impact alarms sounded. Red lumen strips pulsed along bulkheads. Naval officers shouted firing solutions. Militarum adepts clutched their data slates and recited loss projections through chattering teeth. In the bellies of the troopships, the corpsmen stood in their harnesses and waited. They had been issued to the war. Their opinion of its arrival was unnecessary. Watchmaster Cord felt the translation tremor leave the deck plates beneath his boots. His restraints released with a pneumatic hiss. Around him, 2nd Platoon of the 317th Siege Regiment stepped down from the standing racks as one body, laser guns secured across their chests, masks blank, filters rasping in the recycled stink of the hold. No man asked what waited outside. Questions were for officers, and even officers asked them only when answers improved the expenditure of lives. A bulkhead vox clicked alive. All assault elements prepare for atmospheric insertion. Hostile orbital grid active. Casualty projection revised upward. Maintain readiness. The Emperor receives the spent. Cord checked his bayonet lock. He checked the charge indicator of his laser gun. He checked the straps on the recruit beside him, the same one who had once spoken of survival beneath Krieg. The recruit's hands were steady now. That was good. A shaking hand wasted ammunition. On the command deck of the siege flagship Iron Litany, Lord Marshal Othmar Var stood before the campaign hololith while Hyrcan Secundus rotated in green and red light. He was a narrow figure in a long black greatcoat, his rebreather mask marked only by the iron skull of Krieg Command. Around him, officers, tacticians, astropaths, naval liaisons, and scribes formed concentric rings of service. None stood too close. Var had the stillness of unexploded ordnance. The hololith flickered, then sharpened. 5 primary hives glowed like infected organs. 12 macro vaults pulsed beneath them, buried deep under plasteel, adamantine, and oath-sealed Mechanicus architecture. 3 equatorial trench belts circled the planet, each marked with red sigils denoting traitor occupation, mine saturation, fixed artillery, and estimated reserves. Orbital defense platforms remained functional, though several were already crippled by Navy Lance strikes. Hivemorn burned brightest in the projection, ringed by hostile armor. Concentrations and active shield harmonics. Hivekarth flickered in amber. A Vox Savant, his mouth replaced by a brass grill, bowed with mechanical stiffness. Hivekarth continues loyalist transmission. Oxygen recyclers compromised. Population distress severe. Planetary militia remnants request immediate relief. Estimated life support failure within 36 hours. Lord General Marcellus Dravik stood on the opposite side of the hololith in an immaculate stormcoat that had not yet known mud. He was not Krieg. His medals were polished, his boots bright, his face visible. His jaw tightened as the amber icon pulsed. "Then we strike for Karth first," Dravik said. "The loyal districts must be relieved. There are millions still holding in the Emperor's name." Var did not look at him. Hivemorn is the center of rebellion. Hivekarth is dying. All hives are dying. Dravik's eyes hardened. "Lord Marshal, those are Imperial citizens." Var's mask lenses reflected the burning world below. "They are Imperial assets under atmospheric compromise. Hivemorn controls the orbital grid, the macro vault release codes, and the principal rail arteries. Hivemorn must be isolated, then bombarded, then breached, then purged. You would let loyal men suffocate while you build trenches? Yes?" The word had no cruelty in it. That made it worse. One of Dravik's staff officers muttered a prayer. The Lord General leaned over the hololith, stabbing one gloved finger at Hivekarth's amber light. "If Karth falls, every loyalist on this world learns the Imperium abandoned them." Var finally turned his mask toward him. If Hive Morn remains functional, 3 subsectors burn with Hurkan shells, Hurkan tanks, and Hurkan promethium. Your concern is local, mine is correct. Silence spread through the command deck, broken only by the ticking of cogitators and the distant thunder of the flagship's guns. The hololith shifted. The cathedral bastion of St. Drusus reforged appeared above Hive Morn in skeletal outline, a mountain of stone, guns, and stained glass built into the crown of the hive. Its upper spires had been refitted with macro cannon nests, its lower crypts connected directly to the first of the macro vaults. Intercepted Vox hymns crawled across the display, translated by sanctioned lex mechanics. Cardinal militant Heskor Van had declared the tithe false. He had named Terra a glutton. He had preached that the Emperor demanded liberation from Terra's false tithe, that the armories of Hyrkan belonged not to distant bureaucrats but to the faithful blood of Hyrkan itself. His sermons still used the Emperor's name, his soldiers still painted Aquilus on their armor, his militia still carried icons and purity seals, though many now dripped with wax the color of spoiled meat. Below the cathedral, deeper than the official maps admitted, prisoners were being fed into rituals beneath the armory vaults. The picked captures were grainy, taken by dying servo skulls and loyalist spies who had not survived extraction. Men kneeling in ranks before black furnaces, priests with their faces wrapped in scripture strips, chains descending into pits full of red light, bodies opened with ritual care so their blood could run through grooves cut into the vault floors, ammunition shells stacked around chanting circles like offerings to hungry guns. Dravik stared at the images, his face lost color. Var gave no sign that the sight moved him. Target priorities remain unchanged, the Lord Marshal said. First objective, establish landing zones beyond Hive Morn's outer artillery reach. Second objective, deploy siege artillery and armor. Third objective, advance trench lines towards the first equatorial belt intersection. Hive Karth relief is deferred until firing grids are complete. Deferred, Dravik repeated, voice low. Correct. Some would call that murder by arithmetic. Var turned back to the map. War is arithmetic conducted with corpses. The first wave dropped into atmosphere, under fire. From the troop hold, Cord felt the drop lander detach from its mother vessel. Gravity shifted, the world pulled at them. The hull shook as flak began to find them, first as a distant pattering, then as hammer blows that rang through the ribs of the craft. Lumen strips flickered. Somewhere forward, a loader servitor broke loose from its clamps and was crushed beneath an ammunition crate. No one spoke. The dead machine did not matter unless its cargo was damaged. The Voxnet filled with reports. Lander Canticum 7 destroyed. Lander Ash Reliquary struck. Armor complement lost. Lander Graven Tithe venting atmosphere, continuing descent. Casualty column updated. Cord listened while the deck bucked beneath him. The recruit beside him stared forward through round glass lenses. His breathing remained controlled. Through a narrow vision slit, the sky became fire. Another droplander fell beside them, its flank split open by a lance of defense laser light. For an instant, Cord saw the interior clearly. Rows of corpsmen still strapped in, a Lehman Russ chained to its cradle, a priest with one hand raised in blessing. Then the craft came apart, spilling burning men and armor into the high atmosphere. The tank tumbled end over end, trailing fuel and flame until it vanished into cloud below. The Vox clicked again. Lander Penitent 9 destroyed. Personnel and armor written off. Written off. Not mourned, not damned, not remembered. Entered into the ledger and made clean by record. The surviving craft plunged through the fire. When the rear ramp finally slammed down, the world outside was a storm of ash rain, rad fog, and screaming metal. Hyrkan Secundus stank of promethium smoke, wet concrete, scorched bodies, and chemical rot. The sky was the color of old bruises. Enemy shells walked across the landing flats, turning earth and men into black geysers. Krieg officers blew whistles that no one needed. The corpsman advanced because the ramp was open. Cord stepped into Hyrkan's mud. It swallowed his boots to the ankle. He moved forward at once, second platoon spreading behind him. A shell burst to the left and lifted a squad into fragments. A helmet bounced through the smoke, still wearing half a mask. Cord stepped over it and continued toward the assembly marker, a black pennant hammered into the muck beneath a blinking lumen. All around them, the siege army unpacked itself under fire. Lehman Russ demolishers rolled from heavy landers, their siege cannons squat and brutal, their tracks grinding through ash sludge and body parts with equal indifference. Vanquishers followed, long barrels elevating toward distant traitor armor signatures. Punishers rumbled into position, their rotary cannons whining as crews awakened the feed spirits. Earthshaker batteries were dragged from lander cradles by Trojans and sweating servitors. Medusa siege guns came next, ugly and broad-mouthed, built for the intimate destruction of walls. Heavy mortars were assembled in pits already filling with rainwater and blood. Quad launchers were blessed by engine seers whose metal fingers moved faster than prayer. Gorgons crawled down ramps like mobile bunkers, their passenger bays waiting to swallow platoons and vomit them into enemy fire. Centaurs darted between larger vehicles with ammunition and command staff. Atlas recovery vehicles hauled burning wrecks clear of the landing routes. Trojan ammunition carriers formed crawling chains between shell dumps and gun pits. Hades breaching drills were lowered by crane into prepared depressions, their massive drill heads slick with machine oil, their engines coughing awake like beasts beneath the earth. The landing zone was not secured, it was being forced into existence. Colonel Holm stood beside a command chimera half sunk in mud, receiving reports from Vox operators whose greatcoats snapped in the hot wind of nearby detonations. Commissar Severian Holt stood with him, one hand on his bolt pistol, the other clenched around his field glass. Holt had seen war before. He had seen cowardice, heroism, collapse, discipline and slaughter wearing many uniforms. He had never seen men build an artillery park while being shelled as if they were laying paving stones in a parade ground. A junior officer handed Holm an Auspex slate. Mixed returns in district grid Calthus Grey. Refugee mass detected, also hostile movement, possible loyalist concentration, possible traitor screen. Holm studied the slate for less than a breath. Shell it. Holt turned sharply. Colonel. Holm did not look up. Objection registered. That district is broadcasting loyalist codes. It is also masking hostile movement. You do not know that. Uncertainty favors the enemy, Holmes said. Certainty may be manufactured. The order went out. A battery of earthshakers elevated by degrees, their crews working in silence while shells were rammed home and breaches sealed. A priest walked behind the gun line, murmuring blessings into the smoke. The first volley fired with a concussion that punched the breath from mortal lungs. The shells crossed the lowlands in screaming arcs and fell upon Calthus Grey. In the distance, the refugee district ceased being ambiguous. Buildings opened, streets vanished. Heat signatures blinked out by the hundreds, then thousands. Secondary explosions suggested hidden munitions among the hab blocks, or fuel tanks, or kitchens, or the last gathered property of loyal citizens who had believed the Imperial landing meant deliverance. Holt watched the flashes through his field glass. His jaw tightened until the muscle jumped. They may have been loyal, he said. Holland handed the Auspex slate back to the officer. Then they endured as long as required. Holt looked at the Krieg around him. None flinched, none celebrated, none recoiled. The gun crews were already adjusting range. Infantry platoons were already advancing into the cleared zone. Servitors were already hauling more shells. The men of Krieg did not require inspiration. They did not require threats. They did not require the barrel of a commissar's pistol at their backs to remind them that cowardice was death. That, Holt understood with a slow and unpleasant clarity, was not his purpose here. He had not been sent to make them brave. He had been sent to keep them from spending themselves faster than the campaign could use them. The realization tasted worse than the ash. Hours passed in bombardment and descent. More landers died, more survived. The Krieg beachhead widened into a geometry of murder. Trenches were cut with entrenching tools, servo plows and bare-gloved hands. Sandbags were filled with Hyrcan soil, rubble and things no man bothered to identify. Wire went up. Gun pits deepened. Vox masts rose. Tank lagers formed in the lee of shattered habstacks. Corpse processing units marked the fallen, stripped the useful, and dragged the remainder into covered pits for later accounting. The planet resisted them. Enemy macro guns spoke from beyond the smoke. Shells the size of hab rooms fell among the landing forces and turned whole companies into craters. Traitor aircraft shrieked through the low clouds until Hydra flak batteries tore them apart in blossoms of fire. From Hive Morn, cathedral bells rang across the Vox spectrum, layered beneath Cardinal Van's voice. Children of Hyrcan, the false tithe comes in masks and chains. Terror sends grave men to steal your breath and name it duty. Stand. Burn their ledgers. Break their shovels. The Emperor demands liberation. Cord heard the transmission through static while hammering trench stakes into the mud before Hive Morn's distant silhouette. The hive rose beyond the ash plain, black and immense, its spires burning from within, its cathedral crown lit by shield flare and artillery glow. The sight stirred nothing in him except target recognition. A runner slid into the trench, boots skidding in blood-slick clay. Watchmaster! Vox intercept from command. Hive-Karth oxygen failure confirmed within 36 hours. Relief deferred. One of the recruits paused with a sandbag in his arms. Only for a moment. Cord took the sandbag from him and placed it correctly along the firing step. "Continue work," he said. The recruit obeyed. Above them, shells crossed both ways. Imperial guns answered traitor guns. The sky was a ceiling of screams. The first trench line took shape one shovel bite at a time, crawling across the plain like a fresh scar cut into the world's diseased flesh. A shell landed among second platoon without warning. For an instant, there were 6 men where Cord's peripheral vision marked them. Then there was light, pressure, and a wet impact across his coat and mask. The blast hurled mud against the trench wall and filled the air with torn fabric, bone chips, lasgun parts, and a red mist that drifted down with the ash rain. One severed hand struck the trench stake Cord had been holding and slid into the mud at his feet. The recruit who had once said survive stared at the space where the 6 men had been. Cord wiped blood from the stake with his thumb, set it back into place, and hammered it deeper. Only when the revetment held did he turn his mask toward the dead. 6 expended, he voxed. Tools recoverable, 1 lasgun damaged. Position remains functional. Then he reached for the next stake. The first parallel was borne by shovel, not by charge. It did not come into being with banners raised or engines roaring across the plain. It was cut from the poisoned earth 1 spade bite at a time, under a sky that never stopped screaming. The trench grew forward through the ash fields before Hive Morn, as a wound grows in flesh, slow, wet, and inevitable. Krieg engineers laboured at the lip of existence, their greatcoats blackened by mud, their masks filmed with soot, their gloves stiff with dried blood and clay. They dug while shells fell. They dug while las fire cracked through the fog. They dug while men vanished beside them and were replaced without comment. A sapper disappeared when the trench wall collapsed inward, dragging him under a slurry of mud, blood, and shattered stone. Only 1 boot remained visible, twitching once as the weight settled. No one stopped digging. Another corpsman stepped over the boot, drove his entrenching tool into the packed earth, and continued the line. A shell burst beyond the forward lip and hurled 3 bodies across the half-made revetment. 2 were dead. 1 was not. The living man tried to rise, though his left arm ended in strings below the elbow, and his respirator hose had been cut open by shrapnel. He made no sound except the wet hiss of air escaping from his torn mask. An engineer dragged him against the trench wall, packed sandbags around his torso, and used him as support for a firing step. The wounded man's lenses stared upward. He died before the next shell landed. The revetment held. That was sufficient. Watchmaster Cord moved along the trench line with a hammer in one hand and his lasgun slung across his chest. He checked the stakes, corrected the angle of a firing shelf, kicked a dead man's leg out of a drainage channel, and marked a collapsed section for reinforcement. His mask turned left and right in small increments, never wasting motion. The world around him was thunder and ash. The work remained simple: dig, brace, measure, advance. Behind the first parallel, the siege engine of the Death Corps unfolded with cold patience. Reconnaissance elements moved through the rad fog in the distance, the silhouettes of death riders appearing and vanishing like spectres from some older apocalypse. Their mounts picked paths through shell holes and wire fields, nostrils hidden behind reinforced masks, flanks plated in scarred armour. The riders did not seek glory. They counted enemy muzzle flashes, mapped mine belts, and marked the dead ground where infantry would later be spent. Artillery observers crawled into listening posts ahead of the main line, their vox cables trailing behind them like black veins. Rangefinders rose on tripods. Servo skulls drifted low across the mud until enemy sharpshooters cracked them open. Trench saps angled toward the enemy's outer works, narrow cuts through the earth roofed with plasteel sheets and bodies when plasteel ran short. Wire belts uncoiled from reels and were staked down by men whose hands bled inside their gloves. Mortar pits were dug with mathematical spacing. Heavy bolter nests were sighted to overlap across every likely approach, each weapon blessed, loaded, and turned toward the fog. The war was not movement. It was geometry. It was engineering with murder as its proof. Hivemorn watched them from the horizon. The traitor capital rose beyond the killing fields like a mountain of black iron and red glass, its upper spires burning in perpetual stormlight, its cathedral crown hidden beneath shield shimmer and smoke. Macro cannon fire spoke from its outer districts. Bunker clusters growled from the forward trench belt. Searchlights probed the haze, illuminating churned mud, dead bodies, broken tanks, and the pale masks of corpsmen who did not duck unless ordered. Then the enemy answered with poison. The first chemshells fell short, bursting in the waste ahead of the parallel with dull, wet thumps. Yellow vapor rolled outward, hugging the ground, thick as curdled milk. The second salvo landed among the support trenches. The third walked across the Planetary Defense Force auxiliaries assigned to haul ammunition to the Krieg gun pits. The masks of the Death Corps clicked and rasped. Their filters drank the gas. The Krieg kept digging. The auxiliaries did not. Men from Hirkan's loyal remnants staggered through the fog, clawing at their own faces, tearing away scarves, goggles, and cheap rebreathers that had been made for factory fumes rather than military poison. One man ripped his mask free and vomited blood across his boots before his lungs collapsed inside him. Another fell against a stack of mortar shells, fingers hooked into his cheeks, eyes bulging as the gas boiled tears from them. A third ran blind into the wire and hung there, shrieking until the vapor filled his throat and made the scream bubble into silence. Cord watched two corpsmen step around the dying auxiliaries to retrieve fallen ammunition crates. Hazardous atmosphere was not an event, it was a condition. Colonel Holm's order came before the gas had cleared. Forward reconnaissance assault. Bunker clusters designated Malice, Thorn, and Sensor. Draw fire. Confirm arcs. Surviving elements transmit corrections to Master of Ordnance Capel. Objective is information, not occupation. The order passed down the Voxnet and became action. Cord turned to second platoon. What remained of it stood along the trench wall, mud to the knees, bayonets fixed, lenses reflecting the corpse gas drifting above the parapet. The recruit from Krieg, the one who had learned the difference between survival and service, stood near the center of the formation. His designation was VAR according to the slate, though Cord had never spoken it aloud. Names were inefficient unless they improved command. Cord checked the chronometer rune inside his mask display. The assault window opened. "Over," he said. No one shouted. No one blessed the moment. They climbed. The world above the trench was worse than the trench, which was why it had value. No man's land stretched before them as a churned expanse of cratered clay, wire snarls, shell water, broken plasteel stakes, unexploded ordnance, and bodies in various stages of usefulness. Some bodies were fresh, still steaming in the chem fog. Some had been there since the first landing, swollen beneath torn greatcoats. Some were not Krieg, some were not whole enough to identify. The ground sucked at boots and tried to keep every step. Cord advanced at a crouch, lasgun held across his chest, squad spread behind him in a staggered line. They moved toward the first marker, a broken drainage shrine half buried in mud. The fog curled around them. Enemy searchlights swept overhead. For several seconds there was only the distant thunder of artillery and the wet drag of boots. Then Hivemorn saw them. Las fire slashed through the murk in red lines. The first corpsman to Cord's right spun backward as his chest plate burst inward, the beam cutting through armor, coat, ribs, and lungs in a single flash of cooked meat. Another lost his head above the respirator hose, helmet and skull vanishing together in a spray that painted the fog. Stubber rounds struck the mud ahead, walking toward the squad in brutal, chattering bursts. Cluster Malice active, Cord voxed. Left aperture, elevation low, sustained pattern. A mortar round landed behind them and burst open a crater already full of water. Two corpsmen vanished in the explosion. One came down in pieces. A leg struck Cord in the shoulder and slid away, boots still laced, shin bone white through shredded cloth. The squad reached the drainage shrine. Wire traps rose from the mud as the first man crossed them. Hooked strands snapped upward, barbed and weighted, catching him under the arms and through the throat. He was lifted half upright by the tension, boots scraping for purchase, body jerking as last fire found him. His chest became a series of smoking holes. He remained suspended after death, held in a posture that resembled prayer. Cord crawled beneath him. Wire tension trap, marking lane obstruction. A heavy stubber opened from Cluster Thorn. The weapon's sound was deeper than the last fire, a savage mechanical cough that chewed the fog apart. Its first burst struck a corpsman in the abdomen and folded him around the impacts. Its second burst turned him into a shredded coat wrapped around bone, flesh blown out through the back of the greatcoat in red ropes. The third burst caught another across the thighs, cutting both legs from under him. He fell forward and tried to crawl, dragging white splinters through the mud. Cord pressed himself lower, half submerged in a slick puddle, already warm with another man's blood. It seeped over his chest plate and into the folds of his coat. His respirator grated softly. He lifted his range glass, saw the muzzle flash through a broken firing slit, and blink marked the coordinate rune. Cluster thorn active, heavy stubber, 3-finger traverse, aperture partially shielded. Continue, came Kappel's voice through the vox, distant and dry. Second platoon continued. A shell exploded close enough to erase hearing. The world became pressure, white light, and mud. Cord found himself on his side in a crater, half buried beneath a dead corpsman whose torso had been opened from hip to sternum. Steaming organs pressed against Cord's shoulder. He pushed them aside, not because they disgusted him, but because they obstructed his movement. Var crouched nearby, one lens cracked, bayonet still fixed. The recruit's coat was soaked black. He looked at Cord, waiting. Cord pointed toward the third bunker cluster. They moved. Cluster sensor revealed itself only when they were close enough to die properly. Its firing ports opened in the flank of a mound, disguised as collapsed earth. Las beams cut into the squad at waist height. Men folded, burned, and fell. A grenade carried by one dying corpsman detonated beneath him, lifting his body in a brief red halo. Another reached the bunker slope and slammed a crack grenade against the outer plating before a burst from inside tore his arm off at the shoulder. The grenade rolled uselessly into the mud. Cord reached a shell hole within sight of the firing slit. He raised his vox bead and transmitted the final coordinates. A round punched through the lip of the crater and struck the mud inches from his mask, showering his lenses in filth. Cluster sensor active, concealed mound, shielded ports, coordinates marked, remaining strength reduced. Colonel Holmes' voice entered the link. Enemy bunker survives. Cord looked across the field. A handful of his men remained. Var was one. Another corpsman lay beside him with both hands clamped around his own intestines to keep them from spilling farther. A third had no lower jaw and was still trying to clear mud from the action of his laser gun. Beyond them, the bunker fired again, cutting red lines through the corpse gas. "How many men remain?" Holm asked. "Enough to observe its destruction," Cord replied. "Approved." The return bombardment began. It did not arrive as a single act of divine wrath. It came as labor. Earthshakers spoke first from the rear lines, their shells passing overhead with a sound like mountains being thrown by angry gods. The impacts walked across the enemy trench belt in corrected increments. Then the Medusas joined them, short-ranged and obscene, their siege shells punching into bunker faces and turning reinforced ferrocrete into spalling storms of stone and metal. Heavy mortars thumped from hidden pits, lobbing death into communication trenches and assembly yards. Quad launchers barked again and again, laying rippling patterns of fragmentation across wire, parapets, and suspected reserves. The enemy line disappeared by degrees. A bunker lost its roof and kept firing until the next salvo dropped inside it. A trench section heaved upward as if the ground had taken a breath, then collapsed into a wet trench-shaped grave. Men ran from the bombardment and were caught by secondary patterns already calculated for panic routes. Fire, mud, meat, and clay rose together. The shells did not simply kill. They rearranged the world until no living thing could remember where safety had been. Cord remained in the shell hole and observed. Var lay beside him, breathing hard but steady. The jawless corpsman stopped moving. The wounded man holding his intestines still lived until a mortar shockwave rolled over the crater and shook him apart. The bunker-cooled sensor survived the first 3 salvos. Cord transmitted correction. Sensor remains, lower by 12, shift right by 4, armor facing damaged. Kappel's acknowledgement came as a click. A Medusa shell struck the mound directly above the concealed ports. The bunker seemed to swell, then split. The firing slit vomited flame, pressure, bodies, and torn weapon parts. A traitor gunner, still burning, was thrown far enough to land near Cord's crater. He crawled in circles with no legs, hands clawing at mud, mouth open behind a cracked respirator as black smoke poured from inside his coat. Var raised his laser gun. Cord touched the barrel and lowered it. "Ammunition is for threats," he said. The traitor stopped crawling soon after. When the bombardment lifted, there was no enemy trench belt in front of them. There was only a long, steaming depression filled with shattered plasteel, crater water, unburied organs, bunker fragments, and men who had been pressed into the mud so violently that they no longer possessed shape. The first parallel had its answer. The guns had made space for the next act of digging. Quartermaster Rauch walked the aftermath before the smoke cleared. He came with 2 medici servitors, 3 corpse haulers, and a ledger skull that hovered over his shoulder, quill arm twitching. Rauch wore the same mask as the line infantry, but his greatcoat was marked with the bone-pale sigil of his office. A heavy pistol rested in his hand. A surgical saw hung from his belt beside filter tins, morphia ampules, and a roll of tags. He did not hurry. He retrieved lasguns first. Those were stacked in a cart, if repairable, broken across a knee if corrupted by mud beyond efficient recovery. Power packs came next. Grenades, bayonets, filter canisters, entrenching tools, boots where still serviceable. Dog tags were taken after useful materiel, unless the body was too mangled to access without wasting time. Cord watched from the edge of the captured ground as Rauch paused beside the corpsman who had lost both legs to the heavy stubber. The man was still alive. His hands lay folded across his chest. His mask lenses stared up at the ash rain. Blood pulsed weakly from beneath the tourniquets another soldier had tied before advancing. Rauch knelt. Function, the wounded man answered without hesitation. Ended. Pain? Irrelevant. Confession? Debt unpaid. Debt continues through the regiment, Rauch said. The wounded man inclined his head a fraction. Rauch placed the pistol against the center of the respirator mask and fired once. The body stopped leaking effort. Commissar Holt saw it from the trench lip. He climbed down into the churned ground with mud dragging at his boots and fury held tight behind his teeth. The polished severity he had carried from orbit was gone now, dulled by ash, rain, and the things he had watched men do in the name of efficiency. His bolt pistol remained holstered, though his hand hovered near it. That man was conscious, Holt said. Rauch removed the dead corpsman's remaining power pack and handed it to a servitor. Correct. He could have been evacuated. Incorrect. Holt stepped closer. I know a survivable wound when I see one. Rauch turned his mask toward him. His respirator seal was compromised. His blood loss was severe. Extraction through active mud would require 2 stretcher bearers. The nearest aid post is under intermittent shelling. Probability of return to combat was negligible. You murdered him. I concluded him. Holt's eyes narrowed. Choose your next words carefully, Quartermaster. Rauch's lenses were blank circles full of reflected fire. 3 lives for none is poor exchange. For a moment, the only sound was the distant settling of the bombardment and the wet groan of earth collapsing into fresh craters. Holt looked at the dead man, at the servitors stripping him, at Cord and the survivors watching without judgment, at the line of bodies already being sorted into useful and non-useful categories. His duty had always been simple: punish cowardice, inspire discipline, maintain faith, execute rot before it spread. But here, cowardice had no room to breathe, and discipline had become something colder than faith. He had entered a regiment that did not need to be driven forward. It needed to be prevented from marching into extinction before the task was complete. By dusk, the first parallel was finished. It ran across the plain before Hive Morn in a jagged line of mud, timber, plasteel, sandbags, corpses, gun pits, listening posts, drainage sumps, and freshly installed heavy bolters. Vox cable threaded its length. Mortar teams registered their weapons. Medicae servitors dragged the last salvageable wounded to the rear. Priests recited low prayers over ammunition crates rather than men. The dead were counted. The missing were estimated. The ground gained was measured by surveyor stakes, hammered into the meat-wet earth. At the command bunker, the campaign hololith updated. Lord Marshal Varr stood over the projection while Colonel Holm, Commissar Holt, Master of Ordnance Capel, and the attending officers watched the front line crawl forward by a narrow band of green. The first parallel glowed complete. Beyond it, Hive Morn's outer defences pulsed red. A scribe read the figures in a voice emptied of meaning by repetition. Estimated Imperial dead, 41,000. Estimated campaign progress, 0.7%. No one spoke for several breaths. Then Varr lifted one gloved hand and pointed closer to Hive Morn. Begin the second parallel. Inside the command bunker, the dead were recited before the living. No bell marked them. No priest sang them onward. No honour roll rose in solemn triumph. The names of men were too small for the scale of Hircans Secundus. and names were not the language by which the siege understood itself. The bunker spoke in regiments, calibers, shell patterns, meters, and loss columns. It spoke in expenditure and remaining capacity. It spoke in the holy arithmetic of the Astra Militarum, stripped of mercy and made perfect by Krieg. A scribe with ink-black fingers stood beneath a hanging lumen that flickered whenever enemy shells landed too close. His parchment roll trailed across a steel lectern and down into the mud around his boots. Around him, other adepts whispered into brass counting engines, their lips moving behind stained respirator veils. Servitors stamped figures into wax tablets with mechanical hands. Vox operators repeated casualty confirmations from the line. Cartographers marked the campaign map with narrow strokes of green and wider stains of red. 317th Siege Regiment, the scribe chanted. Effective strength reduced, forward companies depleted, grenadier reserve intact, replacements pending. A second scribe answered from another lectern. Earthshaker expenditure by high explosive shell pattern, sufficient. Medusa siege shell expenditure, elevated. Heavy mortar charges, acceptable. Quad launcher fragment pattern, diminished but sustainable. A third voice followed. Ground gained since completion of first parallel, 218 meters. Enemy bunker network remains active. Void shield harmonics confirmed along approach sector, sensor black. No one asked whether the cost was acceptable. Lord Marshal Othmar Var stood at the center of the bunker, hands clasped behind his back, mask lenses fixed upon the hololithic map of Hive Morn. Colonel Adrast Holm stood to his right, rainwater dripping from the hem of his greatcoat onto the steel grate beneath his boots. Commissar Severian Holt stood to the left, his black coat stained by the ash of Calthus Grey and the mud of the first parallel. The bunker trembled around them as traitor artillery searched for the command line. Acceptable was a word for men who believed they could negotiate with war. Sustainable was the only word that mattered. Krieg had known this long before Hirken burned. For generations beneath ash, children born in tunnel cradles had learned that the self was a dangerous fiction. A name could become pride. Pride could become entitlement. Entitlement could become disobedience. Disobedience could become rebellion. Krieg's sin had begun with men believing themselves more important than their duty, and so Krieg had spent centuries grinding that belief from the bones of its descendants. Numbers endured where names corrupted. A number could be counted. A number could be transferred between ledgers. A number could be spent without poetry. In the hypno-vaults, in the tunnel schools, in the barracks sunk beneath irradiated stone, identity was pared down until only function remained. Rifleman, watchmaster, grenadier, engineer, loader, rider, corpse, all were states of service, all were temporary. Redemption alone continued. Cord had never been told his first name, if he had possessed one. He remembered training numbers, intake marks, trench assignments, and the first time an instructor had struck him hard enough to break teeth because he had said my lasgun instead of the lasgun. He remembered the correction better than the pain. Nothing was his, not the weapon, not the coat, not the blood inside him. Det wore many masks. His was merely one among millions. In the bunker, a Cadian liaison officer studied the assault. Projection with the expression of a man watching a slaughterhouse diagram become military doctrine. His name was Major Ren Varro. His left sleeve was pinned empty from a war that had not broken him, and his remaining hand gripped the map rail so tightly the knuckles whitened. He had arrived with the Lord General's staff and had spent the last day trying to understand Krieg by translating their reports into ordinary imperial meaning. It had not helped. He looked at the projected minefield, the shielded bunker nodes, the overlapping fields of fire, and the 3 planned advance waves. "This is mass suicide," Varro said. The bunker quieted by fractions. Scribes did not stop writing, but their voices dipped. Vox operators continued murmuring confirmations. Outside, a shell struck close enough to shower dust from the ceiling. Colonel Holm turned his mask toward the Cadian. "Suicide implies self-regard," he said. "This is expenditure." Varro stared at him. There was no anger in Holm's voice, no fanatic heat, no eager death hunger. The Cadian had seen men driven insane by faith, fear, and glory. He had seen officers spend lives to protect reputations. He had seen desperate commanders order desperate assaults because they had no options left and could not bear to admit it. This was not that. This was procedure. Holm pointed to the first red grid across the approach. "The minefield must be opened. Auspex cannot penetrate the surface interference. Servo skull sweeps failed. Penal servitors lack sufficient density to reveal the pressure arrays. Infantry will advance in close order and mark detonations. Varro swallowed. By triggering them. Correct. And the second wave? Will identify shield emitters and draw bunker fire. The third? Grenadiers carrying melter charges. Varro looked toward Var, perhaps hoping the Lord Marshal would temper the explanation with some higher strategic compassion. Var did not. He watched the map as if the men represented there had already died and were only waiting for the real world to agree. Commissar Holt said nothing. He disliked that silence in himself. Beyond the bunker, the Ministorum had built a pulpit from ammunition crates and broken plasteel sheets behind the forward sandbags. The priest was old, male, thin, and hoarse from shouting over artillery. His name, stitched into a blood-dark stole beneath layers of grime, was Father Enoch Saal. He stood with one hand wrapped around an iron aquila and the other raised toward the smoke-hidden sky. "Men of Krieg!" he cried, while shells fell close enough to rattle teeth. "Servants of the throne! Sons of atonement! The Emperor sees the trench. The Emperor sees the mud. The Emperor sees the blood you have not yet given and weighs it as an offering before the golden throne." A shell struck the parapet beyond the pulpit. Sandbags burst. A body hidden within the wall came apart under the pressure and showered the congregation with bone fragments, scraps of old greatcoat, and clots of blackened meat. One shard struck the priest's cheek, opening him from cheekbone to jaw. Blood ran into his beard. The Krieg did not move. They stood in ranks before him, bayonets fixed but lowered, masks turned toward the pulpit. Cord stood among them with second platoon, his lasgun held across his chest, the recruit Var, 2 men to his right. Their lenses reflected the priest, the fires, the falling ash, and nothing else. Father Saal pressed a sleeve to his torn face and continued, voice trembling now from something other than devotion. "Let the traitor know fear. Let the heretic know judgment. Let your wrath be the hammer of him on earth." No cheer came. No oath shouted back. No fists rose. The priest faltered. He had preached to Cadians who roared, to Mordians who lifted banners, to hive levies who wept and begged to be made brave, to penal troops who needed hatred beaten into courage. But the corpsman of Krieg only listened, silent and already prepared. He could not inflame men who expected to die as calmly as other soldiers expected rations. Cord fixed his bayonet with a click. Thousands of others did the same. The sound unnerved the priest more than any cheer could have. The assault began under a low, poisonous dawn that did not brighten the world so much as reveal more of its ruin. Enemy void shields shimmered ahead in the murk, pale domes of distorted air guarding, bunker mouths set into the broken earth before hive morn. Artillery had punished them for hours. The shells had cratered the approaches, shredded the wire, collapsed unshielded trenches, and pulverized everything soft around the shielded nodes. The bunkers themselves remained, squat and ugly beneath their shimmering protection, weapons silent for now, waiting. The first wave climbed from the trench without a whistle. They moved shoulder to shoulder across the minefield, lasguns shouldered, bayonets fixed, heads level. Officers behind them marked each detonation with range wands and vox clicks. The men knew why they had been ordered forward. There was no deception, no promise of victory, no speech about odds. Their bodies would reveal the safe lanes. Their death would create knowledge. Knowledge would permit the second wave to advance. That was enough. The minefield opened beneath them. The first detonation threw a corpsman upward in a burst of mud and red fragments. His legs separated from him cleanly, spinning away in opposite directions. The men beside him did not break formation. The next mine took 3 at once, folding bodies inward around a flash of white heat. Another charge burst beneath a man's chest and left his boots standing in the mud for a moment after the rest of him had become a wet spray across the coats behind him. Markers went down. A sapper officer spoke calmly into the vox. Pressure cluster active, marked, pattern irregular, advance continues. Men stepped where the dead had not exploded and died where the dead had not yet tested. Some mines were designed to wound rather than kill. Those were worse. Men fell screaming only when their masks were broken enough to make sound possible. One corpsman dragged himself forward on his elbows, both legs gone below the thigh, leaving a thick red path across the mud. He reached the next suspected plate and slapped it with his palm. The mine detonated and completed his usefulness. Behind the first wave, the second advanced over opened bodies. They stepped on backs, ribs, limbs, and pieces of men too small to avoid. Their boots pressed dead flesh into the mud. until the minefield became a map written in corpses. Enemy bunker ports opened, las fire and heavy stubber bursts sweeping the field. The second wave did not return fire at first. They watched. They marked muzzle flashes. They identified shield emitters by the flicker of impact light. They died with their range lenses raised. Holt watched from the command trench until his patience broke. He turned on Holland. Countermand this. Withdraw the second wave. The field is mapped enough for armor. It is not. They are being cut apart. They are fulfilling assigned function. Holt's hand went to his bolt pistol. By the authority of the Officio Prefectus, I can order a halt. Holland looked at him as one might look at a damaged tool. You may attempt it. The words were not a threat. They were an assessment. Before Holt could answer, Lord Marshal Var's voice sounded through the command channel, cold and close. Commissar Holt, state the number of regiments you are willing to preserve at the cost of losing this planet. Holt froze. The Vox hissed with distant static and screams. Var continued. State the number of manufactoria you will surrender to spare this assault. State the number of subsectors you will permit to burn if Hirkan's armories are exported by traitor hands. State the acceptable mercy. Holt looked out across the minefield. The second wave was almost gone. The third waited in the trench, grenadiers hunched beneath packs of melter charges and demolition gear. Young, old, nameless, masked. Not one of them looked toward him for rescue. Holt had no answer, because Var's cruelty was not madness. It was coherent. It was a bridge made of bodies because no other material would bear the weight. Proceed, Holt said, hating the sound of his own voice. The third wave went over. Grenadiers advanced at a run, their heavier armor clattering under greatcoats, hellguns and shotguns slung tight. Melter charges carried like holy relics against their chests. Infantry screens rose behind them. Lehman Russ demolishers crawled forward through the smoke, squat siege cannons barking at close range. Each discharge hammered the air flat. The shells struck bunker mouths, shield nodes and firing slits, turning ferrocrete lips into storms of razor stone. Infantry died around the tanks by the dozen. The tanks continued. One demolisher, Iron Absolution, took a direct hit from a hidden Lascannon. Its turret did not explode. Its crew did not escape. The shot breached the hull and set the interior alight. Through a cracked side hatch, Holt saw flame flicker behind the armor plate, saw hands beat once against the inner seal, saw liquid fire spill out through vision slits. The tank stopped with its engine still growling. Engine seer Lutheran. 9 approached through the shell rain, mechadendrites twitching beneath his red-black robes. He placed a metal hand against the scorched hull and clicked a stream of Binharik lamentation. His servo skull circled the turret, reading heat signatures. Crew function ended, he said. Machine spirit agitated, but serviceable. The hatch was cut open. Smoke rolled out, thick and greasy with cooked flesh. What remained of the crew sagged in their harnesses, fused to the seats and controls. Servitors dragged them free in blackened pieces. One came apart at the waist, spilling boiled organs across the track guard. Lutheran 9 made the sign of the cog over the dead, then turned to the waiting replacement crew. Enter before thermal loss offends the spirit. The new crew climbed into the smoking hull, while the turret was still hot enough to blister skin through gloves. Iron Absolution rolled forward again. At the first shielded bunker, the emitters finally failed. The void shimmer collapsed in a flash of tortured light, and the bunker mouth stood naked before the Krieg. Flamers washed the entrance in burning promethium. Men inside screamed and became shadows thrashing behind fire. Melter charges followed, their heat turning armor plate to white slag. Then the grenadiers entered. Inside, the fighting became intimate. There was no room for formations, no room for artillery, no room for speeches, only a low corridor of smoke, meat, and ricocheting light. Las pistols fired at arm length. Shotguns blew traitor militia apart against the walls. Bayonets drove through ribs, throats, masks, and eye sockets. Entrenching tools rose and fell, cracking skulls, splitting jaws, chopping fingers from weapons. Hands slipped on organs spilled across the floor. Men fell and were trampled until their bones broke under boots. A traitor officer swung a chainsword in the dark and cut one grenadier from shoulder to hip before Cord drove his bayonet through the man's mouth and pinned him against a pipe. The pipe burst, spraying both of them with boiling filth. Cord twisted the blade until the traitor stopped moving. Var fired his lasgun until the power pack emptied, drew his entrenching tool, and struck a crawling enemy in the back of the head until the skull opened like rotten fruit. Another traitor lunged from a side alcove with a mining drill. The bit punched through Var's shoulder plate and burst out through his back in a spray of blood and cloth. Var did not cry out. He dropped his entrenching tool, seized the traitor's mask hose with one hand, and tore it free. Cord shot the traitor through the chest. Var fell only when the drill stopped spinning. The bunker command room was taken with knives and las fire. By the time the last chamber was cleared, the floor could not be seen. It was layered with dead, wounded, severed limbs, shattered respirators, shell casings, burning scripture, and liquid gore made slick by promethium runoff. A grenadier with half his face gone leaned against a cogitator bank and tried to report the room secured, but his tongue had been cut in half and the words came out as wet clicks. Another man, intestines hanging to his knees, held a banner upright until an officer took it from him. The casualty report reached Holm before the smoke thinned. First bunker taken, a Vox operator said. Grenadier losses assessed at 92%. Survivors consolidating. Holm nodded once. Acceptable. Prepare exploitation. Holt closed his eyes for the space of one breath. When he opened them, there was more work to do. Deep beneath the captured bunker, the combat engineers found the first excavation shaft. It had not been marked on any Mechanicus plan. The shaft descended behind a false ammunition wall, cut through foundations that should have been solid adamantine and old rock. Its edges were lined with iron teeth, and devotional parchment turned black with something that was not smoke. Warm air rose from below, wet and foul, carrying the stink of blood, machine oil, and opened graves. Auspex readings slid across the engineer's screen, stuttered, reversed, and began counting downward in symbols the device had not been built to display. The engineer looked at Cord, then at the darkness below. Something moved beneath Hive Morn, not upward, not downward, not along any line the Auspex understood. It moved counter to logic, as if the earth itself had begun to crawl around it. The report reached Lord Marshal Var within minutes. He studied it without visible reaction. "Deploy Hades breaching drill teams," he said. The bunker shook as another enemy shell landed above. Far below, in the warm dark, under the captured works, something answered the impact, with a sound almost like laughter. The war beneath Hive Morn had no sky, no horizon, and no mercy of distance. It began in the captured bunker, with a hole descending into warm dark. The shaft had been cut through ferrocrete, rockcrete, foundation iron, and older strata that should have resisted anything short of siege charges. Its walls were scored by drill teeth, but not imperial pattern. The marks curved in wrong spirals, as if the machine that made them had chewed through the earth while convulsing. Heat breathed from below. The air smelled of rust, blood, engine grease, old incense, and the sour meat stink of bodies left too long in sealed places. Combat engineer Cadre Theta entered first. They came with shotguns held close against their chests, melter guns locked and blessed, demolition charges strapped in satchels across their backs, flamers swinging from reinforced harnesses, gas canisters clinking at their belts, and Auspex skulls bobbing above them on little suspensor fields. Their masks made their breathing loud in the shaft. Every inhalation rasped through filters. Every exhalation hissed back against rubber and brass. The noise filled the tunnel, multiplied by the walls, until it sounded as if the earth itself had been fitted with a respirator and forced to breathe Krieg. Watchmaster Cord descended with them. His squad had been attached to Cadre Theta by Colonel Holm's order. Infantry to hold ground, engineers to break it, quartermaster support to ensure nothing useful remained behind. Cord accepted the assignment without comment, though he disliked the underground. It was not fear. Fear required imagination. He disliked tunnels because artillery could not cleanse what the earth concealed. Above ground, a bunker could be measured, ranged, and removed. A trench could be crushed, a wall could be shattered, a city could be reduced to coordinates and fired upon until the map became honest. Beneath the hive, the world hid itself in angles, ducts, service corridors, collapsed vault access ways, and old maintenance arteries where shells could not reach. The enemy could exist without being seen. That was inefficient. Cord's solution remained simple. Advance, burn, seal, mark, repeat. Behind him, Quartermaster Rauch came down the shaft with 2 Korps servitors, a ledger skull, and a Medici automaton whose bone saw had not stopped trembling since the bunker fight. Rauk carried his pistol in one hand and a salvage hook in the other. His mask lenses were dark with soot. Nothing about him suggested haste. In war, hurry made waste. The Hades breaching drill waited in the chamber above like a chained subterranean beast. Its drill head was wider than a tank hull, its adamantine teeth slick with consecrated oil and the remains of the rock it had murdered. Engine seer Lutheran 9 had blessed its engine spirit with binharic murmurs and struck its casing with a sanctified wrench until the machine growled in acceptable rhythm. The drill had brought the engineers under the outer works of Hivemorn before, bypassing trench lines and bunker foundations where surface assault would cost too much time. Now it would serve again. It would cut paths beneath the enemy's feet. It would deliver Krieg into the underworks like infection entering a wound. Cord did not trust machines that moved through darkness. He trusted what they allowed him to kill. The first tunnel ran low enough that the corpsmen had to bend. Rusted pipework lined the ceiling. Condensation dripped onto helmets and hissed where it struck hot weapon casings. The Auspex skull at the front clicked and twitched, its red eyes stuttering as it tried to read spaces that refused to remain fixed on its display. The walls carried old Imperial markings, freight codes and hazard stripes, but many had been scratched away and replaced with prayers carved by knives. Some were prayers to the Emperor, some had been altered after carving. Cord passed one that read, "The tithe is hunger, the hunger is holy." He marked it with a white chalk slash for contamination and continued. The first enemy position waited beyond a maintenance arch choked with hanging chains. The engineers had detected heat, they had detected motion, they had detected heartbeats, though too many for the size of the chamber. Cadre Theta did not debate. One engineer rolled a gas canister through the chains. Another fired a flamer after it. The chamber beyond became orange light and screaming. Cord entered behind the flame wash, laser gun raised. The traitors inside were not the militia they had fought above. They had once been Militarum workers, perhaps. Men of Hyrcan, born to shell presses and promethium fumes, now cut open and remade with industry's hatred. Several were stitched into gun servitor frames, torsos bolted to tracked cradles, arms replaced by rotary stubbers fed through their own rib cages by belts of ammunition. Their faces had not been removed. That was the worst inefficiency. They still had eyes. They still had mouths. Some were weeping as their weapons fired. The flamers had blinded most of them. The shotguns finished the rest. At close range, the weapons did not sound like gunfire. They sounded like doors being slammed inside skulls. One blast removed a face and painted the wall behind it with teeth, bone flakes, and cooked brain. Another punched through the thin armor of a tracked frame and ruptured the meat wired into it, leaving the man-machine jerking as sparks spat from his spinal plugs. A gun servitor rotated toward Cord, its weapons spooling with a rising whine. Cord stepped inside the traverse, drove his bayonet through the soft underside of the jaw, and fired once. The top of the skull burst against the machine's recoil shield. "Room cleared," said the lead engineer. A scribe rune clicked on the Vox. No one counted the enemy dead aloud. Only rooms mattered. They advanced deeper. The tunnels widened into a cargo artery where conveyor belts ran overhead, still moving. Hooks dangled from chains. Some hooks carried shell casings. Some carried corpses. Men in work robes, stripped to the waist and opened from throat to groin, moved slowly along the line, their blood dripping into troughs below. The troughs fed pipes. The pipes fed something deeper. Servo arms descended at intervals to scrape symbols into the shell casings as they passed. The symbols hurt to look at. Cord did not look long enough for pain to matter. The works of warpsmith Graxhall Vaughan revealed their master before the master showed his face. The traitor had turned Hyrcan's macro-vault machinery into a siege engine for the warp. Shell presses stamped heretical sigils into munitions. Loading claws moved with insect hunger. Cogitator banks chanted corrupted targeting litanies in voices stolen from dead tech adepts. Conveyor belts carried bodies beside artillery shells as if both were parts of the same blessed production cycle. Prisoners knelt in iron racks while brass needles drained them into pressure tanks marked with defaced Aquilus. Above, Cardinal Van preached liberation. Below, his ally manufactured damnation. A priest came at them from a side shrine with a vox grill nailed into his mouth. He wore the robes of the ecclesiarchy, though they were stiff with old blood and machine oil. Loudspeakers wired into his spine amplified his every breath into a hymn of static. His hands held no weapon. His chest had been cut open and filled with small chimes made from finger bones. They rang as he ran. "Rejoice!" he blared through the grill. "The false tithe ends. The true hunger begins." An engineer shot him in the knees. Cord shot him in the head before he finished falling. The Vox grill kept speaking after the skull opened, repeating the word "rejoice" through bubbling static until Rauk crushed the speaker under his boot. "Relic contamination," Rauk said. "Do not salvage." They moved on. The next passage was too narrow to stand abreast. The engineers went one by one, shotguns forward, shoulders scraping both walls. The enemy attacked from murder holes cut at knee height and shoulder height. Hands reached through with blades. Stubbers fired blind. A spear made from sharpened pipe punched through a corpsman's thigh and pinned him to the wall. He lowered his shotgun and fired through the murder hole until the limb holding the spear became mist. A flamer answered the next opening. Burning promethium filled the wall cavity. Men hidden inside became crawling lamps, their bodies writhing through maintenance gaps while their robes burned against their skin. One tumbled out into the passage and clawed toward Cord, face blackening, eye fluid boiling down his cheeks. Cord stepped over him because the man had no weapon. Farther down, a militia squad charged from a junction, driven insane by hunger hymns roaring from speakers bolted into the ceiling. Their armor was mismatched, their eyes were wild. Some had eaten their own lips. They came with bayonets, axes, industrial cutters, and devotional placards painted in blood. There was no room to aim properly. The fight collapsed into breath, impact, and wet force. Shotguns blew torsos open at arm's length. Bayonets punched through gas masks and into mouths. Las pistols fired into bellies until steam burst from backs. A traitor slammed into Cord, striking his helmet with a wrench hard enough to crack one lens edge. Cord trapped the man's wrist, drove his entrenching tool into the side of his neck, and pulled until the blade tore free through tendon and meat. Hot blood struck Cord's mask. His filter clicked once and continued working. A corpsman behind him went down under 3 attackers. They stabbed him repeatedly, screaming praise to the true hunger. He detonated a frag grenade beneath his chest. The blast filled the passage with pressure and fragments. When the smoke cleared, pieces of all 4 men were glued to the walls. "Passage cleared," said the lead engineer. Cord checked the bodies of his men. 2 expended, 1 weapon recoverable. Rauk came through after the fighting, followed by his servitors. He stripped the dead with efficient hands. Filters first, ammunition, grenades, shotgun shells, boots if the souls remained intact, weapons if the actions were clean. Dog tags after that. One engineer lay with his lower body crushed beneath a collapsed pipe cradle. His mask was cracked but not broken. Blood leaked from beneath his breastplate in steady pulses. His gloved hand closed around Rauk's sleeve as the quartermaster leaned over him. "Leave grenade," the engineer rasped. Rauk looked at the enemy icons carved into the walls ahead. He took 2 frag grenades from a dead man's harness and placed them against the engineer's chest. "One for the enemy," he said. "One for himself." The engineer gave a small nod. Rauk moved on. No one said farewell. The tunnels descended again. The air grew warmer. The walls changed from industrial ferrocrete to old foundation stone, then to vault armor veined with pipes that pulsed softly beneath their insulation. The Auspex skulls began to fail. One spun in circles, clicking. Another whispered in a child's voice until an engineer shot it apart. The last projected a map that folded in on itself, showing corridors where none existed and empty space where the men were standing. Cord trusted chalk marks more than machine sight now. He marked every turn, every cleared chamber, every sealed side passage, every corpse pile, every symbol that required later burning. The white lines followed them through the dark like the bones of a path. Then they found the St. Drusus macro vault. The access gallery opened without warning, and the tunnel team stood above a cavern so vast their lamp beams failed before touching the far wall. The vault had been built to hold wars. Artillery shells rested in stacked columns rising higher than hive-hab blocks. Macro crane arms moved across the ceiling on rails, slow and immense. Ammunition trains waited in loading bays. Cogitator shrines lined the platforms. Statues of St. Drusus had once guarded the entrance, but their faces had been cut away and replaced with brass masks shaped like open mouths. The shells were being changed. Conveyor systems fed them into press chambers where corrupted sigils were stamped into their casings. Black fluid sloshed inside transparent feed tubes, pumping from corpse troughs and ritual vats into injection arrays. Prisoners hung above the machinery in chains. opened and drained. Some still moved, their blood mixed with chemical toxins and something that glowed with a light that made the lenses ache. The finished shells emerged steaming, their casings sweating dark condensation, their warheads whispering against their restraints. Demon gas, enough to poison every Imperial trench, enough to turn respirator filters black in minutes, enough to make the dead stand and the living beg for death. If the traitors loaded those shells into the hive guns or orbital munitions cradles, the siege army would choke inside its own lines. Cord did not need an officer to understand the calculation. "Vox command," he said. The squad Voxman, a narrow-shouldered corpsman with a damaged helmet crest, moved to the edge of the gallery and extended the transmitter mast. Static answered him. The Vault distorted the signal. He adjusted runes with slow, careful fingers. "Signal obstruction heavy," the Voxman said, attempting burst transmission. The enemy saw them then. Warning klaxons began in the vault below, deep and animal. Gun servitors rotated on their platforms. Militia surged from gantries. Priests with nailed mouths lifted their arms and screamed through their grills. Something larger moved behind the shell presses, hidden by steam and hanging chains. "Transmit," Cord said. The Voxman began. "Command, this is forward tunnel element attached to Cadre Theta, St. Drusus macro vault located beneath Hive Morn. Enemy converting artillery stockpiles into warp-contaminated chem munitions. Repeat, enemy converting stockpiles into demon gas shells. Immediate destruction required. Coordinates follow." The first volley of enemy fire tore across the gallery. A shotgunner's head burst against the wall. An engineer folded backward, chest opened by stubber rounds. Cord dropped to one knee and returned fire. The gallery became a storm of las beams, shotgun blasts, and ricochets. Flamers washed the stairs below, turning the first rush of militia into screaming torches. Melterguns spat white fury at gun nests, reducing metal and flesh to liquid slag. The Voxman continued speaking. "Coordinates follow, marking from captured bunker descent. Depth estimate compromised, Auspex unreliable. Macro vault extends beneath primary cathedral foundation." A burst from a rotary weapon crossed him from hip to shoulder. His body shredded around the impacts. One arm flew free, still attached to the Vox line. His torso struck the platform rail and almost went over. Cord seized the back of his harness and dragged what remained down behind a slab of broken plating. The Voxman was dead. The transmitter was not. His recorded burst continued to cycle, broken and bleeding static. "St. Drusus macrovault located. Demon gas shells. Immediate destruction required. Coordinates follow. Coordinates follow. Coordinates follow." Rauk crawled to the corpse, pulled the transmitter from the dead harness, and slapped a sealant patch over a sparking cable. "Message repeats," he said. "Good," Cord answered. The gallery shook. Behind them, far up the tunnel route, the Hades breaching drill roared awake. At first, Cord thought it was returning to carve an extraction path. Then the Vox bead in his ear clicked with Colonel Holmes' voice, distorted by stone. "Tunnel element. Enemy counter-movement detected above your route. Drill withdrawal impossible. Rear passage compromised. Collapse authorized to deny pursuit." The ground convulsed. A deep, grinding thunder rolled through the walls. The Hades drill reversed through the upper tunnel, chewing not a path but a tomb. Charges placed by the engineers detonated in sequence behind the team. The way back folded in on itself. Ferrocrete cracked. Stone dropped. Air punched through the gallery as the passage collapsed, carrying dust, sparks, and the distant screams of enemies caught in the falling earth. Cord looked toward the blocked retreat. Rauk stood beside him. His coat was torn. His pistol smoked. Around them, 12 corpsmen and engineers remained alive, some wounded, all masked, all waiting. Below, the macro vault screamed with alarms. The shell presses did not stop. The conveyor belts continued to carry corpses and munitions toward the heart of the traitor engine. Enemy shapes gathered in the steam. Cord checked his laser gun. One charge pack seated. Bayonet fixed. Grenades reduced. Filter functional. He turned from the collapsed tunnel toward the vault. "Forward," he said. Above them, beneath the ash sky before Hive Morn, Lord Marshal Var received the broken transmission, watched the casualty runes update, and gave no order of rescue. The second assault wave was already forming in the trenches. The guns were loaded. The timetable remained intact. "Proceed with surface attack," Var said. Under the dead Hive, Cord and the last survivors advanced toward the St. Drusus macro vault, while the world above continued to spend itself. Dawn did not come to Hirken Secundus. There was only a lessening of darkness behind the smoke, a bruised grey seepage through the ash clouds as the guns began again. The horizon before Hivemorn vanished behind artillery discharge. The sky flashed without lightning. The earth shook without rest. Every impact rolled through the trench lines, through the teeth of the living, through the ribs of the dead, packed into revetments, through the buried roots of the world itself. Across a 50-kilometre front, the second great offensive began. The Krieg advanced behind a moving wall of their own fire. Rolling barrages crawled ahead of them in measured fury, lifting and falling by increments dictated from artillery shrines far behind the line. Earthshaker shells screamed overhead in endless succession, passing so low in some sectors that the air pressure slapped dust from helmets and made coat hems snap like banners. Medusas fired closer, their siege rounds punching through the grey haze toward bunker lips and curtain walls. Heavy mortars coughed from pits flooded with blood and rain. Quad launchers barked in rippling salvos, scattering fragmentation across trenches already churned into open graves. Behind the barrage came the Gorgons. The armoured assault transports lumbered through the mud like mobile fortresses, their flanks scarred, their ramps sealed, their engines growling beneath layers of soot and devotional script, their tracks crushed wire, bodies, shell casings, broken lasguns, and chunks of ferrocrete into the same red-black paste. Infantry walked in their shadows. Row after row of corpsmen moved forward in disciplined waves, heads bowed slightly against the ash rain, bayonets fixed, lenses reflecting the fire ahead. They did not hurry. They did not slow when men fell. They maintained spacing because spacing preserved the advance better than hope. Lehman Russ squadrons moved among them, not as distant armour thrusts, but as iron shepherds assigned directly to the infantry. Demolishers crawled with the platoons, their short siege cannons belching death into anything that survived the rolling barrage. Vanquishers watched for enemy armour through murk and Auspex ghosting. Punishers growled behind the first waves, rotary cannons hungry for bodies dense enough to justify their ammunition. Hellhounds hissed along the flanks, Prometheum tanks sloshing, their crews sealed inside heat and prayer. The wider war machine followed without end. Ammunition trains ground forward behind the artillery parks, Trojan carriers dragging shell loads through trenches made wider for their passage. Atlas recovery vehicles hooked chains into wrecks and pulled them aside before their fires had gone out. Engine seers crawled across holes under shell fire, striking sacred runes into damaged armor, feeding machine spirits with oil, blood, and binary lament. Priests shouted from half-tracks. Medici servitors dragged the salvageable wounded from the mud and left the rest to quartermasters. Vox nets choked on death reports until the words became a second bombardment. Company depleted, gun crew replaced, transport immobilized, forward wave reduced, advance continues. Hundreds of thousands of corpsmen moved beneath millions of shells, and all of them were small before the scale of the Imperium's anger. Hivemorn answered. The outer wall vanished behind shield flare and muzzle flash as the traitors opened their hidden batteries. Macro cannon emplacements spoke from the hive face, each report arriving as a pressure wave that flattened smoke and punched craters into the battlefield large enough to bury hab blocks. Captured Baneblade pattern super heavy tanks rolled from armoured gates beneath the wall, their corrupted hulls daubed with prayers to liberation, their sponsons blazing, their main cannons turning the approach lanes into sudden suns. One macro shell landed among the 8th Company of the 317th. For a moment, there were men, standards, a Chimera command hull, 2 demolishers, and a line of infantry moving through the mud. Then there was a white flash, a rising column of earth and pulverized flesh, and a crater where the company had been. Greatcoat scraps drifted down like burnt leaves. Lasguns fused into warped glass, and metal lay half submerged in mud that boiled from the heat. Men at the crater edge stumbled with their coats on fire and their masks full of blood. The next company walked through them. A Gorgon took a Lascanon strike through its left flank. The beam punched into the assault hold and turned the inside into an oven. For several seconds, the transport continued forward, smoke jetting from its vision slits. The men inside burned in their restraints, silent at first because their respirators sealed the screams into their masks. Then the pressure built and the rear ramp dropped. Fire rolled out. Corpsmen came with it, some walking, some falling, some already dead and carried upright by the crush behind them. Their coats burned, their ammunition cooked off in brief snapping bursts. One man emerged with both arms ablaze, laser gun still held across his chest. He marched 6 paces before collapsing. The men behind stepped over him and advanced into the fire curtain. Another Gorgon lost its track to a mine, slewed sideways and blocked an assault lane. A demolisher named Sainted Burden drove through the obstruction rather than halt. Its dozer blade struck wounded men crawling from the transport and pushed them beneath the tracks with the dead. The sound was wet and hard, like sacks of meat filled with broken crockery. The tank climbed over the Gorgon's torn track guard, crushed 2 bodies into the mud beneath its right tread, corrected its angle, and fired into a bunker mouth at point-blank range. Stopping would have blocked the wave. The wave mattered. The wounded did not. Far to the left of the main advance, Ridemaster Orvan led the Death Riders into a ravine filled with rad fog and old industrial runoff. No banner flew above them. No trumpets sounded. There was nothing noble in the movement. The riders were not knights from ancient Terran myth. They were tools suited to terrain where engines drowned and infantry slowed. Their mounts were chemically hardened, masked, armored at the chest and neck. Their eyes rolled white behind protective lenses. Their hooves struck sparks from buried metal as they descended into the mist. Orvan rode low in the saddle, lance upright, saber chained to his wrist, rebreather hose tucked tight against his breastplate. Around him, the Death Riders moved in file through the ravine, not speaking, each man watching the dim heat ghost of the rider ahead. Rad counters clicked. Somewhere above, shells passed like gods in flight. Somewhere ahead, enemy observers directed the macro cannon fire with line of sight through slits cut in the ridge. Machines could not reach them. The riders could. A traitor listening post appeared as a darker stain in the fog. Orvan raised one hand. The column spread. The mounts climbed the ravine wall with clawed shoes, biting into clay and rusted scrap. A sentry turned too late. Orvan's lance struck him beneath the throat, lifted him from his feet, and nailed him against the observation slit. The man kicked and sprayed blood down the shaft of the weapon. Orvan released the lance and drew his saber. The Death Riders entered the nest like plague. Sabers rose and fell. Hooves smashed knees, ribs, skulls. Shotguns barked in the confined space, blowing observers backward over their map tables. One traitor officer tried to reach a Vox set. A mount bit into his shoulder and tore him sideways, while a rider opened his belly with a downward cut. The room filled with blood, fog, and the stink of ruptured bowels. Orvan stepped over a dying man whose hands were pressed against the stump of his jaw and looked through the firing slit toward Hive Morn's wall. He saw the next observer nest. He pointed with his saber. The riders moved. On the main front, Commissar Holt watched the Krieg walk into fire that had already destroyed 3 waves. The first had vanished beneath macro cannon bursts. The second had reached the wire and died cutting it. The third had followed the paths opened by the dead and was now being erased by enfilading heavy bolters from a shielded wall bastion. Men dropped in rows, coats jumping as rounds tore through them. A demolisher burned in the lane, its ammunition cooking off 1 shell at a time. Still, the next line advanced, boots striking the mud in time, bayonets leveled at a wall few would live to touch. Holt lifted his field glass and saw the truth with awful clarity. The assault was still moving, but it had become waste, not sacrifice. Waste. The fire lanes were not yet suppressed. The macro cannon observers were still functioning somewhere in the fog. Another wave would die without improving the position. He turned on Colonel Holm, who stood beside a Vox mast rattling with impact static. Halt the advance in Sector Gorgon Red. Holm did not move. Denied. 3 waves have been destroyed. 3 waves have reduced the obstacle. They have not reduced it enough. 4th wave will continue reduction. Holt stepped closer, mud sucking at his boots. By authority of the Officio Prefectus and in accordance with Militarum conservation doctrine, I order a tactical halt in Sector Gorgon Red for preservation of ammunition. Holmes' mask lenses fixed on him. For a breath, the battlefield seemed to wait. The words had done what mercy could not. Holt had not asked to spare men. He had named them ammunition. Expenditure to be preserved until it could serve. In Krieg terms, he had spoken sense. Holm turned to the Vox operator. Sector Gorgon Red. Halt 4th wave at current trench marker. Reassign armor to suppress wall bastion. Resume upon confirmation of counter-battery effect. The order went out. Holt felt no triumph, only nausea. Holland looked back at him. Your phrasing was efficient. I did not do it for your approval. Your intent is immaterial. Holt almost laughed, but the sound would have been too human for the place. Above the ravine, Orvan's riders reached the final observer nest as the traitors inside shouted corrections to the macro guns. The Death Riders came over the lip in a wave of mud, gas masks, and steel. One mount took a lasbolt through the chest and collapsed, crushing its rider beneath it. The rider drew his pistol from under the dying animal and shot the nearest traitor twice before another enemy split his skull with a pick. Orvan's saber removed that man's hand, then his throat. The Vox shrine in the nest crackled with live coordinates. A rider drove his lance through the operator's back and into the machine, pinning Korps and transmitter together. Sparks climbed the shaft. The macro cannon fire faltered. Orvan seized the Vox handset in a bloody glove. "Observer nests silenced," he transmitted. "Coordinates marked for enemy batteries." Master of Ordnance Capel received the transmission in a bunker so crowded with cogitator smoke and shouted range corrections that the air seemed made of numbers. He adjusted the firing slate with one finger. "Earthshaker groups Kalthus, Morn, and Jurton," he said. "Shift by marked degrees, counter battery. Sustained fire until wall guns cease or barrels fail." The guns answered. Across the rear lines, Earthshaker batteries elevated as one. Loaders rammed shells home until their hands bled. Breaches slammed shut. Firing prayers were spoken too quickly to be beautiful. The first salvo tore the sky open. Hivemorn's outer wall disappeared behind impacts. The counter-battery fire did not merely strike the macro cannon emplacements. It hunted them. Shells bracketed, corrected, and walked inward. One gun pit took a direct hit that lifted its barrel into the air like a broken finger. Another vanished when its magazine cooked off, tearing a section of wall outward in a blossom of stone, metal, and burning crewmen. Through magnification, Holtz saw traitor gunners running along a parapet with their clothes on fire. The next salvo caught them and painted the wall with their remains. Macro cannon fire stuttered, then ceased. Without the observers, without the wall batteries, without the certainty of annihilation in every lane, the Krieg advance became impossible to stop. Gorgons crossed the killing field. Demolishers crawled forward behind infantry screens and fired into bunkers until the firing slits became red mouths. Hellhounds washed trenches with promethium, flame curling over parapets and down into dugouts where men screamed unseen. Corpsmen reached the first enemy line and entered with bayonets, grenades, trench clubs, and entrenching tools. The outer trench belt became a chain of small, vicious extinctions. Beneath all of it, under kilometers of rock, vault metal, and dead foundations, Cord heard the offensive as a god. The thunder came through the earth in pulses, not sound alone, but pressure. Dust drifted from the tunnel ceiling. Shell impacts rolled through the walls. Somewhere behind them, the collapsed passage groaned under repeated vibrations. Ahead, the St. Drusus macro vault continued its blasphemous labor, conveyors clanking, shell presses stamping, prisoners dying into the pipes. Cord and the 12 survivors moved by the rhythm of the guns. The Auspex skulls were gone. Chalk marks had ended at the collapse. The tunnel geometry shifted under corrupted machine influence, but the barrage above gave direction. Each heavier impact told them where the surface assault moved. Each tremor revealed hollows in the walls, support struts, hidden corridors, and voids beyond armor plating. Cadre Theta's remaining engineer pressed a gloved palm to the ground after every salvo and pointed. Cord followed. "The surface attack covers our movement," Rauch said. Cord glanced at him. "It does not know we live. Knowledge is not required for utility." That was true. They advanced through a service passage slick with condensation and human fat. Behind a grate, machinery pumped black fluid toward the shellworks. Cord marked it for destruction with a strip of cloth cut from a dead man's coat. Ahead, chanting rolled from the macro vault in waves, half hymn, half machine code. The offensive above shook the ceiling again. A crack opened in the tunnel wall, and red light leaked through. Cord raised his fist. The survivors halted. Weapons came up. He could smell the vault now through his filters. Blood, ozone, demon taint, hot brass. The surface war was breaking Hivemorn open, so were they. By nightfall, though night was only a deepening of smoke, the outer trench belt fell. The last bunker stopped transmitting after a demolisher fired 3 shells into its entrance, and a squad of grenadiers sealed the rear exits with melter charges. The last wall gun burned. The last observer nest hung silent above the ravine, its occupants butchered among their maps. The first Krieg standards were planted in the traitor line, not as symbols of triumph, but as markers for artillery registration. In the command bunker, the hololithic map updated. The red ring around Hive Morn's outer approaches fractured. Green advance lines touched the wall sectors and held. Lord Marshal Var studied the display. Outer trench belt neutralized, a scribe intoned. Hive Morn is within direct siege approach. Var inclined his head once. Hive Morn is now approachable. The casualty figures followed. The scribe's voice did not waver. Estimated Imperial dead this day, 312,000. Armor losses severe but sustainable. Artillery expenditure elevated but within projected tolerance. Campaign progress favorable. Colonel Holm accepted the report. Commissar Holt looked out through the bunker slit toward the burning front, where the dead lay so thick in the mud that the living had built paths over them. No one cheered. The Krieg command staff called it favorable, and the guns began preparing the next barrage. Hive Morn did not fall inward. It opened like a wound. The Death Corps entered through the breaches made by siege guns, melter charges, collapsed wall sections, and the patient accumulation of corpses. The outer Hab districts had once been streets, manufacturum floors, transit galleries, shrine avenues, worker dormitories, freight lifts, and public squares roofed by armor glass so filthy that no true sun had reached them in generations. Now they were kill sectors. Every building was a fortress. Every stairwell was a bunker. Every broken window was a firing slit. Every transit tunnel was a throat waiting to swallow men. The trenches outside the hive had been simple by comparison. There, death travelled across open ground in visible lines. Inside Hive Morn, death came from above, below, behind walls, through floors, from vents, from collapsed ceiling ducts, from bodies that had not been bodies until they rose with grenades clutched under their coats. The city had been carved into interlocking ambushes by traitor militia, corrupted manufactorum guilds, and the Cardinal's hunger priests. Hab blocks were chained together with plasteel barricades. Walkways were mined. Elevators were rigged to fall. Chapel doors concealed flamers. Sewer grates hid grenade bundles. Corpse piles breathed until approached. The Krieg did not slow. They mapped. Command divided Hive Morn into sectors, then subsectors, then kill cells. Each Hab stack received a designation. Each avenue received a clearance priority. Each district was classified by value, contamination, resistance, and projected cost. Buildings that could be secured were marked for occupation. Buildings that could not be secured were marked for mining and collapse. Suspected traitor districts were sealed behind rubble walls and left to starve unless artillery could reach them. Civilians were separated into loyal, suspect, contaminated, and obstructive. Only the first category received ration priority. The second received interrogation. The third received fire. The fourth received removal. Removal was an elastic word. Colonel Holmes' orders passed down the Vox without ornament. Sector Ashen Gate, secure transit spine, collapse Hab stacks obstructing armor route, no delay for non-essential population. Lord Marshal Var's broader command followed. Hive Morn must be rendered navigable to Imperial guns. The Krieg turned the city into a problem of movement and death. A Lehman Russ demolisher drove through the front of a Hab shrine, its dozer blades smashing saints, pews, barricades, and bodies into a single groaning mass. The tank's siege cannon fired down a manufacturum avenue and turned a traitor strongpoint into expanding dust. Infantry moved behind it in disciplined files, hugging the broken walls, stepping over severed limbs, through glass, over bricks, through leaking sewage and cooling blood. Heavy bolters were dragged into doorways and set up to dominate intersections. Flamers washed stairwells before men entered them. Grenade teams cleared rooms by rhythm: charge, throw, detonate, enter, fire, mark, continue. Ammunition ran dry in some blocks before the fighting ended. Then men used bayonets, then entrenching tools, then rifle stocks, then hands. A Krieg soldier did not become less dangerous when his weapon emptied. He simply became quieter. Above the surface war, Vox speakers mounted to Hab walls and shrine towers screamed the voice of Cardinal Militant Heskor Van. The traitor's words echoed through smoke and shattered archways, carried by corrupted amplifiers that spat sparks and blood from their grills. Behold the grave men of terror. They come with ledgers and corpse masks. They feed you into the engine and name the grinding salvation. They devour sons, fathers, workers, the faithful, the broken. They do not deny the furnace. They worship it. The Krieg marched under his sermon. No one denied him. A Vox officer beside Colonel Holm asked if counter-propaganda should be broadcast. Holm looked toward the burning avenue where corpsmen advanced behind a demolisher over a carpet of crushed dead. "The statement is not false." The officer hesitated. "Then what reply, sir?" Holm's mask lenses caught the tank fire. "The machine endures. Therefore, mankind endures." The reply was transmitted across the regimental net. It did not rise as a shout. It became a correction, a principle, a fact of war. The machine endures. Therefore, mankind endures. In the lower habs beneath the outer district, Cord led the survivors of the underworks through a service breach that opened behind a line of worker dormitories. The macro vault still thundered somewhere deeper under the hive, but the tremors of the surface assault had cracked transit ducts and revealed old maintenance routes. Cord had followed vibration, heat, and the stink of corrupted munitions until the tunnels exhaled them into the city's lower bones. 12 remained with him at first. By the time they reached the Hab district, 11 remained. One engineer had been taken by a flaw that opened beneath him like a mouth, dropping him into a waste grinder that should have had no power. His scream lasted less than a breath before machinery and meat became the same sound. Rauk marked the location, retrieved the man's dropped melter bomb, and advised against recovery. Cord accepted the recommendation. The lower Hab corridor ahead was narrow, lined with rusted doors and devotional placards scratched over with famine scripture. The lumen strips flickered weakly. Smoke crawled along the ceiling, somewhere behind the walls. Civilians whispered or prayed or waited with knives. Cord raised one fist. The survivors halted. He pointed to the first door. An engineer fixed a breaching charge to the lock plate. The charge flashed. The door blew inward. Cord entered before the smoke cleared, laser gun leveled. His squad followed, weapons sweeping. Inside, men crouched behind overturned bunks with autoguns and mining pistols. The Krieg fired before the traitors finished rising. Las beams punched through faces, throats, lungs, and the thin metal frames of sleeping racks. A man in a factory apron tried to lift both hands. His left hand held a detonator. Rauk shot him through the wrist, then Cord shot him through the chest. The detonator clicked uselessly under the bunk. "Down," Cord ordered the room. 2 civilians dropped flat. A third hesitated. A corpsman shot him. Cord stepped over the body and looked at the 2 survivors. "Loyalty designation?" One shook too hard to answer. The other pressed his forehead to the floor. "Loyal. By the throne loyal. We hid when Van's militia came." Rauk examined them with a handheld scanner. "Malnutrition. Smoke exposure. No immediate warp residue." "Mark for rear processing," Cord said. The men sobbed with relief until a corpsman bound their hands and dragged them toward the corridor. Relief was premature. Processing was not salvation. It was a further test. The next room contained no traitors, only bodies arranged before a defaced wall shrine. Each corpse had been opened and filled with black wax. Their mouths were stuffed with parchment that read, "Blessed hunger," in cramped script. Cord ordered the room burned. A flamer hissed. The bodies ignited one by one, their wax-filled cavities bubbling and popping in the heat. "Room denied," Cord voxed. They continued. Above them, Commissar Holt moved with a command element along St. Borvian Avenue, though no saint remained visible there except in fragments. The avenue was wide enough for tanks and choked with rubble, corpses, and burning Hab furniture. Loyalist banners hung from some windows, traitor icons hung from others. The distinction had become unreliable. A noise rose ahead, not gunfire, not engines, a crowd. They came through the smoke in a stumbling mass, civilians driven forward by militia behind them. Explosive collars circled their throats. Devotional placards were tied across their chests, painted in red letters. "Faith is freedom. Terror is hunger. The tithe is death." The men at the front had their hands bound. Some were gagged. Some tried to stop and were shoved forward by autogun muzzles. Behind them, Cardinal Van's militia advanced in broken ranks, firing over shoulders, laughing and chanting the hunger hymns through cracked respirators. Holt saw what they were doing and raised his hand. "Hold fire!" The Krieg line beside him had already leveled laser guns. "Hold fire!" he snapped again. A Krieg lieutenant turned his mask toward him. "Enemy weapon mass approaching. They are civilians. They are configured as explosive delivery. They are prisoners. They are in the assault lane." The crowd crossed the first range marker. One of the collars detonated. A man's head vanished in a red flash. The blast killed those nearest him, and the militia behind shoved the rest onward through the blood mist. The Krieg fired. Volley fire cracked across the avenue in a clean, disciplined sheet. The front rank of civilians dropped as if cut by an invisible scythe. The second rank fell over them. Collars detonated under impact. Bodies opened, vanished, or spun apart. The militia behind them disappeared into the same disciplined fire, their laughter cut into wet silence by las beams and heavy bolter bursts. Explosions rippled through the crowd until the avenue ahead was carpeted with torn flesh, broken placards, burning collars, and the twitching remains of men who had been used as ammunition by their own saviors. Holt stared at the ruin. Cord emerged from a side breach with his lower hab survivors as the last shots faded. His coat was black with tunnel filth and dried blood. Rauch followed behind him, dragging a sack of recovered filters. Holt turned on him because there was no one else close enough to bear the accusation. "You fired on them." Cord looked across the avenue. "Correct. They were hostages. They were weapons. They were Imperial. Citizens." "The enemy weaponized them first," Cord said. "We neutralized the weapon." The words struck Holt harder than defiance would have. Cord was not excusing himself. He was not seeking absolution. He was describing sequence. Holt looked toward the dead militia beyond the civilian wreckage. He understood the tactical truth. He hated that understanding did not make it less monstrous. In a chapel off the avenue, Quartermaster Rauch established a triage post beneath saints whose faces had been chiseled away and replaced with hunger sigils. The altar became a sorting table. The baptismal basin held spent power packs. The nave filled with wounded men laid in rows by return to combat probability. Rauch walked between them with pistol, injector, and ledger skull. A corpsman missing one arm was given a tourniquet, a las pistol, and assignment to ammunition carrying. A man with shrapnel in both legs but intact hands was marked for mortar loading. A grenadier with an abdominal wound tried to keep his intestines inside his body with both palms. Rauch knelt, checked the wound, checked the man's mask seal, and placed the pistol against his respirator. Function ended. The man nodded once. The shot echoed beneath the defaced saints. Another wounded soldier asked for water. Rauch examined the chest wound, saw bubbles in the blood, and gave him the Emperor's piece instead. A third begged to be returned to his unit despite having no eyes. Rauch handed him a crate of grenades and assigned him to rear trench reserve until collapse. Outside the chapel, Engineer Lutheran 9 knelt before a Lehman Russ that refused to move. The tank had crashed through the chapel doors earlier and crushed half the pews beneath its tracks before a melter blast killed its driver and turned the command crew into cooked meat. The machine still rumbled. Its turret twitched. Its engine growled and stalled in repeated spasms, refusing the replacement crew, refusing the commands painted into its own control manifold. Lutheran 9 pressed 3 mechadendrites into the open driver's hatch. Steam and corpse stink rose around him. Spirit agitation severe, he clicked in Binharic and Low Gothic. Crew death trauma recorded, motive will obstructed, placation inadequate. A penal servitor was dragged forward by 2 tech thralls. It had once been a man. Its skull had been shaved and plated with interface plugs. Its arms ended in restraint cuffs. Its eyes were empty from obedience surgery. Lutheran 9 recited a prayer to the Omnissiah, then shoved the servitor into the driver's socket. Cables penetrated flesh. The servitor convulsed. The tank engine roared as if in pain. Lutheran struck the hull 3 times with a sanctified wrench. "Motion is worship," he intoned. "Obstruction is blasphemy. Advance." The Lehman Russ lurched forward over the chapel floor, grinding bodies, pews, icons, and broken stone beneath its tracks. Rauch did not look up from his triage. The wounded adjusted only if the tracks threatened useful men. Deeper in the lower habs, Cord found the first shell store. It lay behind a Manufacturum loading bay concealed by false rubble. The chamber beyond was cold despite the fires raging in the districts above. Rows of artillery shells rested in cradles, their casings painted with Imperial markings that had been scratched through and overwritten. Each shell had a glass inspection slit cut into its body, crude but deliberate. Behind the glass moved a black organic slurry that thickened and pulsed like diseased blood. One traitor remained alive among the crates, pinned beneath a fallen loading claw. His respirator had been torn away, and the lower half of his face was slick with black fluid. He smiled when Cord approached. "Too late," the man whispered. "They are saints in the womb." Rauk crouched beside one of the shells and held a scanner to the glass slit. The device whined, sparked, and displayed corrupted runes before he struck it with his palm. "Composition," Cord said. "Human remains," Rauk answered. "Industrial toxins, warp reactive residue, unstable, suitable for gas dispersal, unsuitable for recovery." The traitor laughed until blood filled his throat. "They will bloom over your trenches. They will sing in your masks." Cord shot him once. "Mark for destruction," he said. Before the engineer could place a charge, the world above them changed.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support really helps.
A sound rolled. Through hive morn, unlike the artillery, it was deeper, slower, almost reverent. The lower hab lights flickered and died. Dust rained from the ceiling. Every Vox channel screamed at once, then cut into static. Far behind the advance, over the Krieg rear lines, the first demon shell detonated. Those who saw it lived only long enough to misunderstand it. The shell burst above the artillery parks without fire at first, opening like a black flower in the ash clouds. Light poured from it, though light was the wrong word because it cast shadows in every direction. Men's silhouettes burned into walls, gun shields, ammunition crates, and the sides of tanks. Their bodies remained standing for several seconds after their shadows had been stolen from them. Some took another step, some tried to reload guns with hands that were no longer flesh but blackened frames. Then the pressure arrived. Filters burst, eyes boiled behind lenses. Gun crews folded around their own screams. Servitors tore themselves from their mounts. Horses in the rear cavalry lines kicked through their own stalls and died biting iron. Earthshaker crews vanished under clouds of black vapor that moved with purpose, flowing into mouths, seals, wounds, and prayer books alike. In the command bunker, the hololith flickered as casualty runes multiplied across the rear line. A scribe began to sob and was removed by a guard before the sound could become contagious. Colonel Holm looked to Var. Holt stood beside them, face grey beneath soot, waiting for the order that any ordinary commander would give. Fall back, regroup, seal the line. Lord Marshal Var watched the black bloom spreading over the rear artillery parks. "Respirator filters to contamination pattern black," he said. "Issue replacements from reserve stockpiles. Increase artillery dispersal." Holt stared at him. "The rear line is dying." "Yes. We need time to contain it." Var turned his mask lenses toward Hive Morn. "The enemy has demonstrated capacity. Delay increases repetition." Holm understood first. "Accelerate the advance." "Correct," Var said. "Hive Morn will be taken before it can fire again." The order passed into the burning city. In the lower Habshell store, Cord received it through broken Vox static, while the black slurry inside the captured shells pulsed against the glass. Advance accelerated. He looked toward the ceiling as another distant tremor rolled through the hive. The enemy had reached the trenches with what waited in the vaults. The war above had become poison. The war below had become the only path to silence the guns. Cord reloaded his laser-gun. "Charges set," the engineer reported. "Detonate," Cord said. They left the shell store burning behind them and moved deeper into Hive Morn, toward the place where saints were being born inside artillery shells. The rear echelon had become a chapel for things that should not have lived long enough to pray. The demon's shell had opened above the artillery parks like a black flower, and where its light had fallen, men had been unmade by degrees. Some died at once. Their shadows burned into gun shields and ammunition crates while their bodies fell as empty sacks. Others remained upright for several heartbeats after death had claimed the necessary organs. They walked. They reached for shells. They tried to drag rammers back into breaches with hands that had turned to blackened sticks. One loader took 3 steps with his skull split open and a thin blue flame licking from the fissure, then collapsed against the wheel of an earthshaker and smeared what remained of his face down the metal rim. The horses screamed worst of all. The Death Rider remount lines had been caught at the edge of the bloom. Masked beasts kicked against their restraints, their armored heads tossing, their eyes reflecting light that had no source. One animal burst its own heart against the inside of its ribs and kept thrashing until its spine snapped. Another bit through the forearm of the handler trying to cut it free, then died with the severed hand still in its teeth. The stable pits filled with steam, dung, blood, and panic so thick it seemed another gas attack had rolled through them. Priests moved among the dying with censers and iron aquillas, trying to bless men whose lungs were full of black light. Father Saul stood beside a collapsed ammunition stack, his torn cheek newly stitched with wire, chanting the litany of final service, while a gunner vomited glowing smoke into his own mask. The priest pressed the aquila against the man's brow. The gunner's lenses flashed from within. His chest swelled against his straps, ribs cracking one by one, and then his breath burst outward through his filter in a plume of dark radiance that set the priest's sleeve alight. Father Saal beat the fire out against a corpse and continued praying. No rout followed. No panic spread along the Krieg lines. The dead were counted. The contaminated were marked. The wounded were sorted. Replacement gun crews stepped over bodies still twitching with warp residue and took their places at the surviving guns. Servitors dragged ruptured ammunition crates into quarantine pits. Quartermasters shot men whose filters had failed and recovered the filters from those whose faces had not yet dissolved into unusable matter. The Death Corps response to horror was not horror, it was calculation. Master of Ordnance Capel stood in a bunker whose walls trembled with each enemy shot and listened to the world trying to kill him. His command pit lay beneath 6 layers of timber, plasteel, sandbags, dead earth, and bodies. Cogitator arrays filled the chamber, their rune screens flashing in green and amber, their casings rattling with every impact. Servo skulls hovered above brass plotting tables, triangulation needles twitching as distant shell bursts were registered by sound, tremor, pressure, and crater report. Vox operators murmured through cracked lips. Scribes fed coordinates into artillery ledgers. A dead aide lay in the corner beneath a blanket because removing him would require 2 men Capel needed for range transcription. Capel had removed his gloves. He touched the vibration plates with bare fingertips. He did not hear artillery as other men heard it. To him, every shell was a sentence. Every detonation possessed grammar. Bore, charge, angle, wind, distance, fault, crew discipline, barrel wear, platform stability. He listened to the enemy guns and read their souls by the wounds they left in the earth. Another impact struck the rear trench line. Capel closed his eyes. Not fixed emplacement, he said. Mobile platform, heavy recoil compensation, delayed echo. It fired beneath partial shielding. An adept's voice crackled beside him. Enemy gun position remains uncertain. Incorrect, Capel said. It has moved. He opened his eyes and marked 3 points on the slate. Pattern indicates crawler mount, fire, displacement, shield recovery, fire again, warpsmith construction. The next shell landed short of an ammunition train and burst into black vapor. Men nearby died without falling, standing in place while their skin tightened against their bones and split at the joints. Capel watched the tremor rune. He watched the echo delay. He watched the smoke drift on the pict feed until the image died. There, he said. The plotters bent over their charts. The enemy guns were not simple batteries. Warpsmith Graxel Vaughan had mounted gun cathedrals on industrial crawlers, each one a shrine, siege piece, and blasphemous engine fused into a single moving altar. They emerged from Hive Morn's broken districts beneath void shield umbrellas, fired demon munitions from sanctified artillery throats, then withdrew into ruins before Imperial counterfire could settle. Each platform dragged chains of prisoners behind it. Each cannon was crewed by traitor tech adepts, their nervous systems wired into recoil engines so that every discharge broke their bodies and fed their pain back into the firing machine. Their screams sharpened the aim. Their blood cooled the breaches. Their prayers were not prayers. Capel did not hate them. Hatred did not improve range. He required eyes closer to the guns. Forward observation needed, he said into the command vox. Enemy crawler battery cannot be fixed by rear triangulation alone. Require observer to remain under targeted fire until displacement rhythm confirmed. Colonel Holm's answer came first. Projected survival? Negligible. Projected utility? Decisive. Approved. Commissar Holt stood in the same command bunker, soot on his face, coat torn by masonry fragments, eyes fixed on the map table as if the parchment might flinch before he did. Who is closest? Holt asked. Capel checked the runes. Watchmaster. Cord. Forward lower hab breach. Surface access near Manufactorum ruin designated Iron Psalm. Holt looked at Holm. He is one of the few who found evidence of the demon shells. Correct, Holm said. And you will spend him as bait. Correct. Holt looked back to Capel. Will he understand the order? Capel did not look up. He will not require understanding beyond purpose. The transmission reached Cord beneath a collapsed transit arch where the lower hab tunnels opened into the gutted remains of Manufactorum Iron Psalm. The building had once assembled recoil sleeves and shell hoists for the Hurricane armories. Now its upper floors were broken into jagged tiers, its cranes hanging like dead insects, its production lines clogged with rubble, corpses, and cooling slag. Portions of the roof were gone, giving narrow views of the hive war above. Through those gaps, Cord could see the bruised night flash with artillery. Rauk stood beside him, stripping grenades from a dead engineer. Only 9 of their tunnel party remained now. Some had been lost to the macro vault approaches, some to militia, one to a contaminated shell casing that had whispered through his respirator until he opened his own throat with a bayonet. Cord listened to Kappel's order in silence: forward observe, draw fire, confirm crawler movement, transmit corrections until relieved or expended. There would be no relief. That was not cynicism. It was terrain assessment. Cord turned to the survivors. We ascend. Rauk clicked the cylinder of his pistol back into place. Ammunition state poor. Observation does not require abundance. It requires duration. Then we will spend slowly. They climbed through broken maintenance ladders and slagged stairwells until they reached the Manufactorum's 3rd elevated floor. Though the concept of floors had become uncertain after repeated shelling, steel plates hung at angles, conveyor tracks crossed open air where the walls had fallen away. Bodies lay trapped beneath machine housings, some Hurricane militia, some Krieg, some too burned to classify. Cord positioned his men along the surviving windows and roof rents. He laid a field transmitter on a cracked cogitator plinth and sighted through a gap in the wall. Beyond the Manufactorum ruins, the enemy gun cathedrals moved. They crawled through the darkness on hundreds of grinding industrial legs, taller than hab blocks, each crowned by a cannon wrapped in chains, scripture, and twitching cables. Void shields shimmered over them in oily domes. Prisoners hung from their flanks in cages, swaying with the motion. When one fired, the entire structure bowed backward, its crew shrieking through speakers as recoil tore their wired nerves. The shell rose, trailing black light, and vanished toward the Krieg rear lines. Cord transmitted. Enemy crawler visible, bearing marked, shield active, movement west by southwest after firing. The reply came in Kappel's voice. Remain in place. Confirm next displacement. The gun cathedral turned. Its cannon throat lowered toward Manufactorum Iron Psalm. Rauk saw it too. Incoming. Hold position, Cord said. The first shell struck the upper floors. The impact removed the roof and most of the level above them. Machinery, stone, bodies and fire poured down. One corpsman disappeared beneath a press assembly. Another was sliced in half by a falling girder that struck cleanly through his waist and pinned both halves apart in a widening fan of blood. The pressure threw Cord against a pillar hard enough to crack one of his mask seals. Pain flashed white along his ribs, his mouth filled with blood behind the rebreather. He rose before the dust settled. First impact high, he voxed. Enemy adjusting. Crawler remained stationary for reload count, marking duration. The second shell landed lower. The floor bucked. A wall collapsed outward, taking 2 corpsmen with it into the burning avenue below. One screamed only after he hit the rubble. The other did not scream at all. A burst pipe sprayed boiling coolant across the room. Rauk dragged a wounded engineer clear by the collar, saw the man's legs had been mashed into pulp below the knees, removed the remaining demolition charge from his harness, and left him with a grenade. Cord watched the crawler through a curtain of dust. Enemy crawler withdrawing after reload. Shield flicker during movement. Bearing update follows. Blood leaked from beneath his mask's damaged seal and ran down the rubber hose in slow black beads. He pressed one glove to the crack, not to stop the bleeding, but to preserve pressure in the respirator. His other hand worked the transmitter. Another shell came. This one struck the floor beneath them. For an instant, the Manufactorum rose. Then it fell through itself. Cord was thrown into darkness with stone, metal, and bodies collapsing around him. The world became impact after impact after impact. Something crushed his left leg below the knee. A piece of masonry struck his shoulder and numbed the arm to the fingers. The transmitter slammed against his chest and cracked but did not die. He lay beneath a slab with the corpse of a corpsman pressed across him, the dead man's opened abdomen spilling warmth over Cord's coat. Dust choked the air. His mask filter rasped and clicked in distress. Somewhere nearby, a man was buried alive and speaking the Krieg death catechism, one line at a time. Cord lifted the transmitter with his working hand. Observer remains, he said. His voice came through wet and distorted. Enemy crawler displacement confirmed. Coordinates transmitting. Capel heard him beneath the bunker. He took the corrections and began to build the enemy's rhythm. Fire, wait, recoil vent, shield instability, displacement, pause, shield recovery, fire. The pattern emerged not as a line on a map, but as a pulse. Vaughn's gun cathedrals were not fleeing at random. They moved between prepared sanctuaries, ruined Militarum courts reinforced with portable shield pylons and sacrificial recoil anchors. Every shot revealed the next refuge if one listened correctly. Capel listened. Box barrage, he ordered. Outer bracket on sanctuaries, harassing fire on probable movement corridors. Destructive fire on active platforms. Counter-battery groups prepare storm pattern. The artillery park, wounded though it was, answered. Field guns continued to support the infantry crawling through Hive Morn's outer districts, dropping shells ahead of platoons and cutting traitor counterattacks apart in the streets. Heavy mortars kept pressure on barricades. Quad launchers stitched hab blocks with fragmentation, but the great guns turned their deeper attention upon Vaughn's crawlers. Earthshakers shifted. Medusas loaded siege shells. Ammunition crews worked in blackened masks among piles of dead from the demon strike. Those with burned hands loaded one-handed. Those who could no longer lift shells were given pistols by quartermasters and concluded behind the gun line. Holt watched all of it and felt something inside him alter. He still found the Krieg monstrous. That had not changed. Perhaps it never would. They killed too easily. They saved too rarely. They measured men with a coldness that made even the Departamento Militarum seem sentimental. But he had begun to understand why enemies feared them in ways they did not fear ordinary soldiers. They could not be terrorized. The demon shell had not broken them. Van's sermons had not seduced them. Vaughn's machines had not awed them. They could not be bribed with survival, because they did not believe survival belonged to them. They could not be exhausted in any meaningful human sense, because exhaustion was simply another condition under which duty continued. They could not be broken by horror, because Krieg had been born after the end of its own world and called the ruin a lesson. Their cruelty was not lack of discipline, it was discipline without mercy. The thought sickened Holt because it was true. Ridemaster Orvan confirmed the final coordinates. His night sortie passed through ruins where the demon shell's residue had made time unreliable. The riders entered a plaza beneath a shattered dome and saw themselves already dead, their bodies lying in the ash ahead of them. One rider saluted his own corpse as he passed it. Another rode through a pocket of cold blue light and aged to bone in the saddle between one hoofbeat and the next. His mount continued for 6 paces before collapsing, and the rider's skeleton came apart inside the armor with a dry clatter. The formation did not break. Orvan marked the contamination zone and rode around the remains. The final gun crawler waited in the shell of a Militarum basilica, shielded by 3 pylons made from inverted statues of imperial saints. Prisoners hung from the pylons by hooks through their ribs. Their bodies twitched in unison whenever the shield brightened. Orvan raised his lance and pointed. A rider with a flare launcher fired a marker shell into the ruin. Red light burned beneath the void shield for the span of 3 breaths. That was enough. Capel gave the order. Earthshakers and Medusas fired for 43 minutes without pause. The first salvos built the walls of the kill box. Shells fell behind the crawlers, before them, beside them, sealing their movement corridors with fire and pulverized stone. Harassing fire struck the routes where the machines might flee, forcing them inward. Then destructive fire descended. Medusa shells hammered shield pylons until the air itself seemed to crack. Earthshaker rounds plunged into the Militarum basilica, each impact deeper and closer than the last. The void shields failed one by one. When the first gun cathedral lost protection, a shell struck its cannon housing and split it open. The recoil engines screamed through every speaker mounted to the machine as wired tech adepts cooked inside their harnesses. The chained prisoners along its flank ignited. The crawler tried to move, legs grinding, but a second shell struck beneath it and folded the entire platform into a pit of molten metal. The second crawler fired once more before dying. Its demon shell climbed into the sky, was struck by flak and burst too high to do more than stain the clouds with black veins. Then 3 Earthshaker rounds hit its magazine. The explosion tore the machine apart from within, sending wheels, brass ribs, human cages, and burning shell fragments across the ruins. The last crawler tried to retreat into Hive Morn. Orvan's flare still burned beneath it. Capel adjusted by a fraction. The Medusas spoke. The enemy artillery park became a lake of fire, torn metal, cooked ammunition, and screaming machine spirits. Gun barrels bent like wax. Shield pylons toppled. Prisoners burned in their cages. Traitor tech adepts thrashed as cables ripped their nerves free. The air filled with the shriek of machinery dying in pain, a sound that made even Lutheran 9 pause in distant communion and murmur a Binharic ward. When the barrage ended, the silence felt hostile. It spread across the rear lines, across the hive approaches, across the ruined artillery sanctuaries where Vaughn's guns had stood. For the first time since the demon shell bloomed, no enemy counter-battery fire answered. Only secondary fires burned. Only ammunition cooked off in sporadic cracks. Only the wounded made noise, and even that faded as quartermasters moved among them. In the collapsed remains of Manufactorum Iron Psalm, Cord dragged himself free from beneath the slab with Rauch's help. His left leg bore weight badly. Blood had dried around his mask seal and cracked when he breathed. Of the men who had ascended with him, 3 still lived. 1 could walk, 1 could crawl, 1 could transmit if someone held the Vox unit to his mouth. Rauch examined Cord's leg. Damaged, still functional. Then it remains attached, Cord said. For now. The Vox net crackled before either could speak again. At first, Cord thought it was interference from the shell residue. Then the sound deepened and multiplied. It came through every channel. Command, artillery, infantry, armor, Medicae. Even the dead Vox units clicked alive and whispered from beneath rubble. Voices, thousands of them. They chanted in high Gothic, each syllable spoken backwards, each word dragged through static as if pulled from a throat already buried. The sound rose from beneath Hive Morn, not from its towers, not from its walls, but from the deep places below the cathedral and the macro vaults. Capel heard it in the command bunker. Holt heard it and felt his skin crawl beneath his collar. Var heard it and turned toward the hololithic image of St. Drusus macro vault as its sealed doors changed from amber to red. In the darkness beneath the hive, something vast began to open. The macro vault doors were moving. By the time the Death Corps reached the primary gate of Hive Morn, the battlefield had ceased to resemble ground. It was a continent of churned remains, mud made from ash, blood, promethium runoff, fire-suppressant foam, pulverized ferrocrete, and human fat sucked at boots and tracks alike. The dead lay so thick before the wall that the living marched upon. Then, because there was no other surface left, greatcoats floated in shell holes like drowned banners. Rebreathers stared upward through the muck with glass lenses full of rainwater. Bayonets jutted from the mire like iron reeds. Severed hands still clutched lasguns whose barrels had fused into glass from thermal wash. The air tasted of cordite, corpse gas, hot metal, and the old rot of a hive that had begun feeding on itself. Before them rose the gate. It was not a gate as lesser worlds understood such things. It was a fortress wall several kilometers wide, a bastion face layered in void shields, macro cannon casemates, murder holes, flame vents, mine belts, razor wire fields, recoil towers, bunker blisters, and armored shrine ports from which traitor priests chanted into loudhailers with tongues cut into devotional forks. The portal itself was a slab of adamantine and plasteel tall enough to swallow titans, braced by buttresses carved in the image of imperial saints now defaced with famine runes. Corpse gas vents opened and shut along its base like the breathing holes of some buried animal. Lord Marshal Var named it Objective Mortis. No one questioned the designation. The campaign had become a compressed echo of wars the Death Corps had fought before. Men whispered Vrax in the rear echelons, not as legend, but as precedent. 17 years of siege, millions dead, heretics behind walls, demons beneath shrines, and the Corps advancing trench by trench until history itself seemed to rust under their boots. Hucan Secundus did not have 17 years to surrender. Its armories would poison subsectors if allowed to breathe, so the logic of Vrax was forced into days. The patience remained, only the interval shortened. Lord Marshal Var stood beneath a dripping bunker vault while the hololithic map trembled with impact distortions. Objective Mortis glowed red before him. Colonel Holm waited at his right. Commissar Holt stood farther back, no longer clean, no longer shocked by every cruelty, and no longer innocent enough to believe disgust was an answer. Var gave the order. The 317th, 412th, and 809th Siege Regiments would make the frontal assault. Combat engineers would take Hades-breaching drills beneath the gate foundations and place charges against the shield relay routes. Lehman Russ demolishers and Thunderer siege tanks would advance with the infantry and target visible shield nodes. Heavy artillery would maintain suppression until barrels failed, crews died, or the gate ceased to exist. A scribe read the projected casualty estimate. No one asked him to repeat it. The assault began with bombardment. The sky above Objective Mortis vanished behind falling shells. Earthshakers struck the wall face and burst into storms of flame and stone. Medusas hammered casemate lips. Heavy mortars walked fire across the razor wire belts. Quad launchers filled the approaches with screaming fragmentation to keep enemy heads below the parapets. Shadow swords in the rear adjusted their volcano cannons with predatory patience, while Baneblades and Macarius heavy tanks crawled into firing positions behind ranks of infantry and burning wrecks. Then the Death Corps went forward. The first waves crossed ground already carpeted with bodies from the previous advances. Men sank to the knee in softened flesh and mud. Some disappeared entirely into shell holes hidden beneath floating coats. Others were cut down by lass fire from murder holes before they had taken 10 paces. Their bodies fell and became footing for those behind them. Officers marked cleared lanes. Sappers crawled into wire with cutters and charges. Medici servitors followed until their treads clogged with gore and they were dragged aside by quartermasters for parts. The traitors waited until the Krieg reached the first mine belt before revealing their new defenders. The Iron Warriors' aligned warband emerged from the smoke without haste. They were not a legion. They were not a grand host from the old wars. They were a hard knot of siege killers, black iron and hazard-striped plate, helms like brutal machines, bolters chained to gauntlets, servo arms twitching over their shoulders, trophies of broken Imperial armor nailed to their pauldrons. They moved through the gate's lower bastions as if they had built the wall themselves and hated it for being imperfect. Their voices rolled across the Vox in guttural bursts, contemptuous and amused. "Insects!" one of them voxed across an open channel. "The Korps Emperor sends insects with shovels." The Krieg advanced. The first Chaos Space Marine stepped into the killing field and fired his bolter into a squad from the 412th. Each shell detonated inside a man and opened him in a different way. One burst at the chest and emptied red steam from the coat. One took a head and left the body walking for 3 blind steps. One struck a grenade harness and turned 3 corpsmen into a spray of meat and metal. The warrior laughed through a grill full of static. The squad died around its Voxman. The Voxman had lost 1 leg, his left arm dragged behind him by tendons. His mask was cracked and full of blood. He did not fire. He crawled, inch by inch, over mud, over the opened belly of another corpsman, over razor wire that peeled strips from his gloves. He dragged himself close enough to the Iron Warrior for the locator room to confirm. The Chaos Space Marine noticed him at last. "Still crawling," the traitor said. The Voxman pressed the marker stud. "Target marked," he whispered. Master of Ordnance Capel received the signal. His face did not change. "Efficient," he said. The barrage fell. 3 Earthshaker shells and a Medusa round struck the marker. The Iron Warrior vanished beneath fire, stone and pressure. 30 Krieg vanished with him. When the smoke cleared, nothing remained but a crater lined with torn ceramite, shredded greatcoats, and chunks of meat too mixed to sort by allegiance. Capel entered the exchange into the ledger as favourable. The super-heavy armour engaged soon after. Imperial Baneblades rolled forward through the smoke, their many guns blazing into wall bastions, their hulls covered in ash and devotional script. Macarius heavy tanks advanced in squadrons, battle cannons roaring, track guards grinding against wreckage. A shadow sword waited behind a ridge of dead armour, its volcano cannon drinking power until the air shimmered around the barrel. The traitors answered with captured super heavies bearing defaced Aquilas and chains of corpses welded to their hulls. 1 Baneblade pattern monstrosity came through the smoke with its turret crowned in iron scripture and its sponsons firing without pause. Its tracks crushed a platoon from the 809th beneath them. Men disappeared under the links with wet pops and snapping bone. 1 Corpsman, dragged beneath the track up to the waist, continued firing his lasgun until the pressure burst him open against the mud. A melter team crawled under the traitor tank while it advanced. 3 men reached its belly. 2 were crushed before they armed their charges. The third lost both legs when the hull ground down over him. He still had his hands. He fixed the final charge against the tank's underside, locked the rune, and lay beneath the machine as the melter bomb awakened. The explosion lifted the Super Heavy by a fraction and split its guts open. Burning fuel, ammunition, crew matter, and molten metal poured through the wound. The tank rolled another few meters, then sagged into the mud, its engine screaming through torn exhausts like a dying animal. The Shadow Sword fired. Its volcano cannon turned the nearest gate bastion into a white line through reality. Armor, shrine stone, macro cannon crews, and shield emitters became light, then vapor, then falling slag. The bastion did not explode at first. It simply ceased to understand its own shape. Then the ammunition inside cooked off, and a section of objective mortise bulged outward, showering the approach with molten metal and screaming traitors. Still, the gate stood. Still, the void shields shimmered. Still, the Iron Warriors killed. Holt watched from the forward command trench as another Krieg wave entered a fire lane already slick with the remains of 3 others. He felt the old impulse rise in him, the human command to stop it, to save them, to halt the bleeding before it became absurd. Then he saw the Hades drill markers flicker on the map below the gate. The engineers were nearly under the foundations. The surface assault was not meant to win alone. It was meant to hold every eye, every gun, every monster on the wall. He closed his fist around the Vox handset. "Sector Mortis Grey," he said. His voice was hoarse. "Commit reserve platoons to diversionary advance along the left wire belt. Heavy. Smoke. Fix bayonets. Draw casemate fire away from subterranean approach." Colonel Holm looked at him. Holt did not look back. The order would kill hundreds, perhaps thousands. It would save the Hades teams. If anything, beneath that gate could still be saved. He hated himself because the calculation was clean. He hated himself because the order worked before the first men died. The diversionary wave rose and moved left through smoke. The gate guns turned. Casemates flashed. Men vanished in strings, cut apart by heavy bolters and Lascanon fire. A Chaos Space Marine on the parapet leaned over the wall and emptied his bolter into them, laughing until a thunderous siege tank put a shell into the stone beneath his feet and dropped him into the approach mud. He rose from the crater, armor cracked, one arm hanging loose. The next Krieg wave walked toward him. His laughter stopped. Beneath objective mortis, Cord moved through sewer access with what remained of his battered squad. Rauch followed with pistol drawn. 2 engineers remained from Cadre Theta, both carrying charges meant for the shield relay station. 3 corpsmen came behind them, one limping, one with a bandaged throat, one carrying the field vox. The sewer was a press of hot darkness. Sludge moved around their boots. Pipes sweated black condensation. Above them, the surface assault struck the ceiling as continuous thunder. They found the relay station behind an iron sluice gate guarded by Iron Warriors serfs. The serfs were mortal, but remade in the image of their masters. Their arms were thick with grafted muscle and tool plugs. Their heads were shaved, branded, and studded with cranial pins. They carried shotguns, heavy tools, and blades made from tank armor scrap. They fought without fear because fear had been cut out and replaced with obedience to worse things. Cord breached the gate with a charge. The blast folded the first rank of serfs backward. The Krieg entered through smoke and filth. Laser guns cracked. Shotguns answered. 1 Korpsman took a blast to the chest and fell with ribs exposed through his coat. Rauch stepped over him, shot a serf through the eye, then stripped the fallen Korpsman's grenades while still moving. Something roared in the relay chamber. It had once been an Ogrin, perhaps more than one. Its flesh had been swollen, stitched, armored, and pierced with iron rods. A plate bearing the Iron Warrior's chevrons had been bolted over its face, with a narrow slit cut for one bloodshot eye. It carried a hydraulic hammer in both hands. The first swing crushed an engineer into the wall so hard his body burst across the pipes behind him. The second swing broke the limping corpsman from shoulder to hip. Cord fired into the creature's eye slit. The last beam burned deep but did not kill it. Rauch threw a crack grenade at its feet. The blast took one leg at the knee. The thing fell, roaring, dragging itself forward with one massive hand. Cord stepped close enough that its reaching fingers scraped his boot and drove his bayonet through the eye slit. The blade jammed against bone. He fired. The back of the creature's skull ruptured against the iron plate, spraying the relay wall with brain matter and black blood. The shield station lay beyond. Gun servitors hung from ceiling rails, their weapons swiveling. One opened fire and cut the Vox carrier in half. The man fell in 2 directions, the field transmitter skidding across the floor. Another servitor tracked Cord. Rauch shot its exposed ammunition feed. The detonation tore the machine's torso open and showered the chamber with fragments. Only 3 of Cord's team reached the relay core, half gone, still enough. The surviving engineer placed the charges against the shield harmonics column with hands that left bloody prints on every clamp. Cord held the doorway, firing controlled shots at serfs emerging from the sewage dark. Rauch dragged the field transmitter from beside the bisected Voxman, checked it, and shook Gore out of the grill. "Signal weak," he said. "Send anyway." Rauch transmitted the charge confirmation in bursts of static and wet feedback. Above, Holt watched the relay rune flicker from red to amber. "Continue diversion," he ordered. His aide stared at him. "Commissar, those men are gone." "Not yet," Holt said. "Spend them until they are." The words tasted like ash and iron. They were his now. He had chosen them, or Hyrcan had, forced them into his mouth. Either way, men died because he had learned to speak Krieg. Beneath the gate, the Hades-breaching drills reached their marks. The machines roared under the foundations, drill teeth screaming against stone and adamantine. Engineers placed charges where the shield relay route sank into the gate's bones. Melter warheads armed, demolition packs primed. The relay station charges blinked in time with the ones below. Cord watched the rune turn green. "Withdraw?" Rauch asked. Cord looked at the sewer route behind them, now filling with serfs and gunfire. "No!" Rauch nodded as if this were the expected answer. The charges detonated. Objective Mortis did not fall from the surface assault. It fell from below. The first sign was the void shields dying. The shimmer across the wall flickered, folded inward, and vanished in sheets of blue fire. Then the foundations lifted. A sound like a world breaking rolled across the battlefield as Hades charges, relay explosives, and buried munitions ignited together beneath the gate. The adamantine portal buckled, buttresses cracked, macro cannon casemates tilted outward. Murder holes became mouths spilling flame and bodies. The gate fell inward, not all at once, but in layers. Stone avalanches poured into Hive Morn's inner district. Shield towers collapsed through the roadways behind them. Casemates broke loose and slid down the wall face, crushing traitors, Krieg, tanks, and the dead without distinction. Dust swallowed the approach. The shockwave knocked men flat kilometers away. Even the Bane blades rocked on their suspensions. When the dust began to thin, the Death Corps saw the opening. Hive Morn's cathedral district waited beyond, lit from within by red fire and black lightning. Spires leaned over streets filled with smoke. Bells rang though no hands pulled them. From somewhere beyond the fallen gate came the backward high Gothic chant, louder now, sung by thousands of throats in perfect wrongness. Something vast moved in the smoke. A horned shape passed between the burning towers, too large to be a man, too deliberate to be smoke, too real to be dismissed as fear. Lord Marshal Var saw it through the hololithic distortion and gave the next order before anyone else found words. "Advance through the breach." The gate fell inward, and Hive Morn showed them what it had become. Beyond Objective Mortis, there was no city left in any sane meaning of the word. The inner hive had been remade into a cathedral of meat, brass, smoke, and manufacturum chains. Streets had been roofed with hanging bodies. Transit rails looped between spires like iron veins. Conveyor belts crossed open plazas, bearing corpses toward the central shrine in endless procession. The dead moved not because they lived, but because the machines beneath them had not ceased to obey. Hooks dragged men by the ribs. Crane arms lowered carcasses into vats that steamed red and black. Prayer banners made from stitched skin hung across avenues where imperial saints had been flayed from the walls and replaced with brass masks screaming without lungs. At the heart of the district rose the cathedral bastion of St. Drusus reforged. It had once been a place of imperial worship. Now it was an engine. Its spires had been bound in chains thick as tank hulls. Its stained glass windows glowed with the furnace light of the macro vaults beneath. Its bells rang without rhythm, each peal answered by a tremor from below, as if something enormous was striking the foundations from the underside. Processed dead poured into the cathedral through conveyor mouths, through rail tunnels, through open trenches cut into the nave floor. Millions had been fed into the machinery. Loyalist civilians, traitor workers, prisoners from the outer hives, Krieg dead taken from the field, enemy dead, unsorted flesh. All of it went below. All of it became tithe. Cardinal militant Heskor Van had promised liberation from Terra's false tithe. He had built another tithe beneath the altar. The first demons came through the smoke in the wake of the gate's collapse. They spilled from alleys, shrine doors, sewer mouths, corpse vats, and cracks in the paving stones. Some crawled on too many limbs. Some walked like men wearing butchered animals as robes. Some were red muscle and horn, some pale gristle and hooked claws. Some no more than mouths dragged upright by hatred. Their eyes burned with colours the mind rejected. Their bodies bled smoke, teeth, flies, and hot black ichor that hissed when it struck the mud. They did not charge in disciplined ranks. They poured. Beside them came traitor militia, driven beyond sanity, their faces painted with ash and blood, explosive scripture tied around their arms. Behind them strode iron warriors aligned siege killers, bolters roaring, armour scarred by the gate's fall, servo arms twitching with mechanical irritation. They moved through the daemonic tide without reverence. To them, warpspawn were another siege asset. Their contempt remained intact until the Krieg began advancing through both. The Death Corps did not understand fear as other men did. They understood contamination. Flamers were ordered forward. Plasma guns were issued to grenadier remnants. Melter charges were prepared for anything with armour, horn, or machine casing. Artillery was brought danger close before the first demonic wave reached the breach. The command vox filled with calm reports delivered through static and screams. Warp entities confirmed. Respirator seals holding. Faith contamination probability elevated. Prometheum reserve committed. Advance continues. Colonel Holmes stood in a forward command ruin beneath a statue whose head had been replaced by an enemy loudspeaker. The statue still wore the robes of an imperial saint. The speaker still played Van's voice, though shell damage had warped the sermon into a wet, repeating phrase. The hunger freeze, the hunger freeze, the hunger freeze. Holm ignored it. A mass of civilians emerged from the inner district, running toward the Krieg lines through the smoke. Men in worker robes, shrine vestments, manufactorum rags, and prisoner chains. Some carried white cloths. Some carried icons of the Emperor held high in trembling hands. They stumbled over rubble and bodies, screaming for protection, for mercy, for extraction from the hell opening behind them. An Auspex operator swept them and stiffened. Warp exposure signatures, he said. Mixed, severe, unstable. Commissar Holt heard the report and felt the battlefield narrow to the civilians' faces. They were filthy, starving, burned, terrified. One man clutched a child's toy made from scrap wire. Another had the acula cut into his forehead with a knife. They were Imperial subjects. They were running from demons toward the Emperor's soldiers. Holm gave the order. Burn them before contact. Holt's bolt pistol was in his hand before he remembered drawing it. The muzzle aimed at Holm's side. The colonel did not turn. Commissar, Holmes said, resolve your hesitation. Holt's finger tightened. Then the first refugee split open. His back arched. His chest burst outward in a spray of ribs, black fluid, and clutching hands that had been growing inside him. Something unfolded from the ruin of his torso, slick and horned, wearing his skin around its shoulders like a wet cloak. It leapt into the nearest Krieg fireteam and killed 6 men in the space of 3 heartbeats. One was torn in half. One had his head bitten from his neck. One fired his flamer as he died, bathing his own section and the creature together in burning promethium. The Krieg line opened fire. Flamers roared. The refugees burned. Some died as men. Some screamed in voices, too many for a single throat. Some burst apart and birthed things that crawled burning across the ground until laser guns and plasma fire cut them down. Holt lowered his pistol slowly, not because Holm had been right in any moral sense, but because the battlefield had punished morality for arriving late. Holm looked at the burning mass. Contamination neutralized. Holt wanted to speak. No words survived the attempt. Within the inner hive, Cord received his order at a junction where 3 Manufactorum avenues met beneath a collapsed rail bridge. The junction controlled access to a breach route leading toward the Cathedral District and another route descending toward the macro vault service levels. If the demonic infantry overran it, the Krieg spearhead would be split and the engineers below cut away from support. If it held long enough, Kappel's guns could range the plaza beyond. There was no extraction plan. There was only time to be purchased. Cord stood with what remained of his force. Rauch was there, one side of his greatcoat stiff with dried blood. 2 engineers remained. A handful of corpsmen from other shattered platoons had been folded into Cord's command because their officers were dead and their bodies still functioned. One carried a plasma gun with a cracked heat shroud. Another had a flamer and a limp. The rest had lasguns, bayonets, grenades, and the stillness of men who had received an order containing no ambiguity. Cord looked down each avenue. The left was filling with smoke and demonic silhouettes. The right crawled with militia. The central approach shook beneath something heavier, something still hidden behind hanging chains and red vapor. He fixed his bayonet. The others did the same. "Hold until artillery range confirmation," Cord said. No one answered with vows. They took position behind broken machinery, fallen shrine stones, tank wreckage, and heaps of bodies dragged into cover. Rauk moved among them, redistributing grenades from the dead and the badly wounded. A corpsman whose lungs bubbled beneath his breastplate offered up his power packs. Rauk accepted them, checked the man's mask seal, and left him one grenade. The first demons hit the junction like a tide of knives. Lasguns burned holes through impossible flesh. Some holes stayed open. Some closed with lips and began whispering. Plasma fire took one creature in the chest and reduced it to a column of white heat and screaming vapor. The flamer washed another swarm as it crawled over the barricade, turning bodies into thrashing fire shapes that still tried to bite while burning. Cord fired until his charge pack ran dry. He ejected it, loaded another, and fired again. A demon vaulted the wreckage ahead of him, all horn and stretched skin, its mouth opening down the length of its torso. A corpsman thrust his bayonet into it. The blade sank deep and emerged coated not in blood, but in tiny teeth. The creature split the man from shoulder to belly with one claw and dragged the corpse against itself, absorbing pieces of him as it came forward. Cord threw a frag grenade into its torso mouth. The explosion staggered it, but did not kill it. It lunged. Cord met it with a crack grenade in his left hand. He drove his arm into the creature's open maw, up to the wrist, feeling teeth close through glove and armor, feeling fingers shear away under pressure. He armed the charge by touch with what remained of his hand and shoved deeper until the grenade lodged in the hot meat of the thing's throat. The demon bit down. 3 of Cord's fingers came away inside it. He fell backward as the crack grenade detonated. The creature's head and upper torso burst into black fire and horn fragments. The blast threw Cord against a broken shrine pillar. He rose with his left hand reduced to torn glove, blood and exposed bone at the missing fingers. Rauk glanced at the wound. "Still functional," the quartermaster said. Cord retrieved his lasgun with his remaining fingers and right hand. "Correct." The line closed around the gap. Elsewhere along the breach, Holt climbed onto the hull of a burned chimera and tried to give a speech. He spoke of the Emperor, of the line, of the sin of retreat, of the duty owed by every imperial soul. His voice carried over the non-Krieg auxiliaries clustered behind the Death Corps positions, Hurkan loyalists and surviving Planetary Defense Force troops whose eyes were wide with the sight of demons among their own streets. The Krieg did not look at him. They did not need him. The auxiliaries did. Some listened, some wept. Some made the sign of the Aquila with hands that shook too violently to form it. Some broke when the next wave of demons came shrieking through the smoke. 2 PDF officers turned and ran, dragging their men with them. Holt shot the first in the back. The second turned at the sound and raised both hands. Holt shot him through the face. The men behind them stopped running. "You will stand behind the Krieg," Holt shouted. "You will fire when they fire. You will move when they move. If courage fails you, borrow their obedience." He saw the words strike them, not as inspiration, as structure. Cowardice had less room to breathe behind Krieg lines. The men reformed in broken clumps, still terrified, still mortal, still soft in ways the corpsmen were not, but they raised their weapons. They fired into the smoke. That was enough. At the junction, Cord's line began to fail. Not from fear, from arithmetic. There were 2, many dead and not enough living to occupy the same length of barricade. The central avenue became a slope of bodies. Demons climbed it. Traitor militia fired through them, uncaring whether they struck warp flesh or Imperial soldiers. An iron warrior appeared at the edge of the smoke, bolter in hand, hazard-striped helm turning as he assessed the barricade. "Insects," he voxed. Rauk shot him with a las pistol. The beams scorched his pauldron. The iron warrior looked at the quartermaster. Cord transmitted through the field vox with blood leaking from beneath his mask's lower seal. "Junction engaged. Enemy density sufficient. Artillery requested. Danger close." Capel answered through static. "Correction needed." Cord looked up at the broken rail bridge. He saw the 3 avenue markers. He saw the shell scars. He saw his men locked in close combat with things that should not exist. "Fire on my position," he said. There was a pause. Not long. Capel was not sentimental. Confirmed. The first Earthshaker shell landed beyond the junction and removed the Central Avenue's mouth in a pillar of fire. The second struck closer, collapsing the rail bridge and crushing demons, militia, Krieg and rubble into one another. The third hit the left approach. Pressure slammed through the barricade and threw Cord off his feet. His ears filled with a ringing so complete it became silence. A corpsman beside him came apart from the waist down. Another vanished beneath masonry. The flamer tank ruptured and washed the barricade in burning promethium. Capel walked the barrage inward. Shells tore the building apart floor by floor, walls peeled away, machinery toppled, shrine columns exploded into stone knives. Men were pulped by pressure waves, sliced by masonry, buried alive under falling Militarum decks. Demons died screaming, their bodies unraveling into smoke and wet light. Traitors vanished. Krieg died without altering the requested fire. Cord survived because a larger corpse fell across him. It had been one of the traitor Ogrin things, or something close to it. Its bulk covered him as the roof came down, absorbing fragments that would have opened him from head to groin. He lay pinned beneath its cooling meat, breathing through a filter clogged with dust and blood, listening to shells kill everything above him. Then the barrage lifted. The junction was gone. So was the demonic wave. Cord pushed his way out from beneath the corpse, leaving pieces of his coat and skin behind where the dead weight had pressed him into broken stone. Rauch emerged from a mound of bodies nearby, one lens cracked, pistol still in hand. Of the others, Cord counted movement in 3 places, enough to report, not enough to hold another assault. Junction denied, Cord voxed. Capel's reply came faintly. Efficient. Deep beneath the cathedral, Angenseer Lutheran 9 followed corrupted machine code toward the macro vault core. He moved with a guard of Skitarii remnants, Krieg engineers, and a pair of servitors carrying sanctified cutting tools. His mechadendrites twitched in agitation as he read the data bleeding through the walls. The machine spirits of Hive Morn were not merely distressed, they were enslaved. Their Binharic prayers had been inverted and chained to rhythms that resembled heartbeats. Access runes screamed when touched. Cogitator banks displayed targeting calculations written in devotional High Gothic and scrap code from the warp. Lutheran 9 tasted blasphemy through his augmetic tongue. Warpsmith signature confirmed, he clicked. Designation Graxel Vaughn. Macro Vault Core compromised. Orbital capable delivery systems active. The image transmitted to command was fragmented but sufficient. Beneath the cathedral bastion, Vaughn's machinery was loading demon shells into launch cradles and macro delivery systems intended for planetary defense and void interdiction. The shells were larger than those already fired, swollen with black slurry, bound in brass ribs and connected by feeding tubes to vats of processed dead. If launched into the siege army, the fleet, or the wider theatre, Hirken would not merely rebel, it would infect the war beyond itself. In the command bunker, Var watched the projection. The tactical staff had already calculated withdrawal routes. They existed, barely. The Krieg could fall back beyond the immediate dispersal radius, abandon the breach, surrender the ground gained, and begin again after decontamination. It would cost time. It might save regiments. Holt saw the option appear on the slate. For the first time, he expected Var to take it. Not from mercy, from preservation of force. The Lord Marshal did not. If we withdraw, the enemy completes launch preparation, Var said. If the enemy's will to survive exceeds ours, the siege has already failed. Holm nodded. No retreat. No retreat to give, Var corrected. He opened the general command channel. Every regiment heard him. Every tank, every gun, every engineer, every wounded man still connected to a functioning vox bead. Cord heard him beneath rubble at the erased junction. Rauch heard him while stripping grenades from a corpse. Holt heard him standing beside burned auxiliaries who no longer knew whether they were alive by courage or accident. By authority of Krieg Command and Imperial Reclamation Mandate, Var said, expenditure absolute is ordered. Every reserve regiment, every tank, every gun, every engineer, all assets will advance. All artillery will fire until destroyed, depleted or overrun. Hivemorn will be taken now. The Vox crackled with acknowledgement codes from thousands of throats and machine mouths. In the rear lines, reserve regiments rose from their trenches. In the armor parks, damaged tanks were crewed by anyone with hands. At the gun lines, barrels already glowing were loaded again. In the underways, Hades teams armed their final charges. At the breach, men fixed bayonets beside burning corpses. The final assault began not with a cheer, but with the sound of an entire army accepting death as the price of correct motion. Hive Morn would fall, or Hyrcan Secundus would become another Krieg. The quartermasters came before the last assault, moving through the trenches with ledgers, pistols, filter tins, and corpse servitors. They did not bless the men. Blessings belonged to priests, and the priests were busy shouting over the guns, coughing ash from their lungs, and pressing iron aquillas against the brows of soldiers who would be dead before the prayer reached its final syllable. Quartermasters had more useful work. They checked respirator seals with gloved fingers. They tightened bayonet locks until the clicks ran down the firing step like insect legs. They denied morphia to men still capable of walking. They cut ammunition from the harnesses of the dead and gave it to those who had not yet earned that condition. They stripped grenades from shattered bodies, removed charge packs from hands that had stiffened around them, and broke the fingers when the fingers refused to open. Rauk walked among them as if through a harvest. His coat was torn at the shoulder, stiff with old blood, and dusted grey from the ruins of the junction. One lens of his mask bore a crack sealed with resin. His left glove had burned through in 2 places, exposing bandaged fingers beneath. He carried no banner, no surgical retinue of honor, no symbol of mercy, except the heavy pistol holstered against his thigh, and even that mercy was issued only when function had ended. A corpsman sat against the trench wall with one hand pressed to his abdomen. Blood seeped between his fingers and soaked into the mud beneath him. His mask was intact. His lasgun lay across his knees. 2 grenades remained on his belt. Rauk knelt beside him. "Stand," the corpsman tried. His body managed half the motion before the wound opened wider and something wet slid against his coat lining. He settled back without a sound. "Return to line unlikely," Rauk said. "Confirmed," the soldier answered. Rauk removed the grenades first, then the charge packs, then the bayonet from the lasgun, because the rifle itself had mud in the action and would require attention before reissue. Only when the useful things had been recovered did he draw the pistol. "Det continues through the regiment," Rauk said. The corpsman bowed his head. The shot was small beneath the artillery. A wounded grenadier watched Rauk rise and move on. The grenadier had lost an arm at the elbow and half the armor plating across his chest. His breathing rasped, but his legs worked, and his remaining hand could still grip. "Quartermaster," the grenadier said. "Morphia." Rauk turned his cracked lens toward him. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Can you fire?" "Yes." "Morphia." "Denied." "My arm is gone." "Your trigger hand remains." Rauk took 2 power packs from a dead man nearby and pressed them into the grenadier's hand. "Advance when ordered." The grenadier's head dipped. "As required." Rauk did not enjoy suffering. Enjoyment was indulgence, and indulgence was waste. He had seen cruelty in other regiments, the hot kind, the laughing kind, the kind that came from fear pretending to be strength. Krieg had no use for that. Suffering was neither virtue nor spectacle. It was a resource condition. A man dying with unused grenades was a logistical failure. A man screaming when silence-preserved breath was inefficient. A man preserved beyond function consumed 2 stretcher bearers, medical stores, rations, time, and space that might be spent on soldiers who could still hold a firing line. Waste was sin. Krieg had taught him that before he learned the sound of his own designation. The guns opened again. Across the shattered inner hive, Gorgons ground forward through streets swept by demon fire. Their armor plates were scorched black, their ramps dented by shell impacts, their hulls crawling with infantry who could not fit within. The transports carried corpsmen into avenues where the paving stones moved under carpets of dead and half-dead things. Chains hung from overhead railways, dragging bodies toward the cathedral engine. Manufactorum smoke rolled low through shrine plazas. Brass growths had erupted from walls where warp heat had fused machine parts with bone. The air screamed in voices that came from no mouth. The Gorgons did not stop unless immobilized. When one took a stream of unnatural flame across its flank, the soldiers clinging to that side burned in place, their coats igniting, their ammunition popping, their boots still hooked against the armor rungs. The ramp dropped anyway. Infantry poured out through the smoke and the smell of cooked men. They formed lines behind chunks of broken masonry and advanced into the next chapel, where traitor militia fired from behind rows of pews stacked with corpses. Grenades cleared the stairwells. Flamers washed the chapels. Heavy bolters turned corridors into red spray. Every room became a separate war. Every door became a breach point. Every altar became a barricade. Men fought among broken icons and shell racks, under murals of saints whose painted eyes had been scratched away. A squad would enter a chamber with 8 men and leave with 3. Those 3 would be folded into the next squad at the next doorway. Ammunition ran dry. Bayonets went in. Entrenching tools rose and fell. A traitor with a chainsword cut a corpsman from collar to hip before another Krieg soldier drove a shovel blade through his throat and pinned him against a confessional screen. A demon thing crawled along a ceiling on hooked limbs until a plasma gunner burned it in half. The pieces fell still biting. Beneath them, the Hades breaching drills entered the foundations of the macro vault. Their engines roared under hive morn like buried beasts. Drill teeth chewed through stone, ferrocrete, old metal, and sanctified seals warped by heresy. Engine seers chanted through bursts of machine cant. Combat engineers rode in the cramped compartments behind the drill heads, melter guns braced between their knees, demolition charges clamped to their harnesses, faces hidden behind lenses filmed with condensation. The Hades machines had been made for this work, for going beneath what could not be crossed, for delivering men into the underbelly of fortresses that believed walls made them eternal. The first drill broke into a service vault and was immediately struck by Lascanon fire from a hidden embrasure. The crew compartment became a furnace. The second drill drove through the wreckage of the first, crushing the dead machine aside and opening its ramp into smoke. Combat engineers emerged firing. Melter guns turned sealed doors into white sagging wounds. Demolition charges shattered vault locks. Flamers cleansed maintenance galleries where serfs with metal teeth and nail-studded brows tried to hold the approaches with industrial saws. The engineers did not shout warnings. The underworld had no use for warning. They opened, burned, sealed, marked, and advanced. Cord led the remnant that no longer deserved to be called a squad by any regulation slate. He was wounded in more places than Rauk had bothered to count. His left hand was a ruin of bandage, missing fingers, and stiffening blood. One leg dragged when he moved too quickly. His hearing came and went in waves, sometimes leaving the world muffled except for the interior rasp of his respirator, sometimes returning with every shell impact sharpened into pain. He had 6 men when he entered the macro vault approach. 2 were engineers. 1 carried a flamer with a damaged pilot light. 1 had a plasma gun that whined every time the charge coils built heat. 1 was a line corpsman whose mask had been repaired with strips of scripture and sealant. The last carried the field vox. There were not enough men for proper formation doctrine, so Cord used what remained. Bodies became markers. A dead traitor placed at a corner indicated a cleared route. A dead corpsman with his lasgun propped across his chest indicated return path and ammunition salvage. Mines became shepherds. Cord armed captured charges and placed them behind side passages, forcing enemy serfs away from flanking routes and into prepared fire lanes. Collapsing tunnels became weapons. Twice he ordered engineers to bring down ceilings behind advancing militia, crushing the pursuers and sealing the path at once. One collapse killed a Krieg wounded man who could not move clear in time. Cord recorded the loss and continued. Rauk followed close enough to keep the remnant supplied and far enough back to survive the first impact of each ambush. He stripped the dead without kneeling when standing saved time. He reloaded men who could no longer use their own fingers. He shot 1 engineer whose chest had been opened by shrapnel and handed the dead man's melter charge to Cord without comment. Above, in the forward command ruin, Commissar Holt found Colonel Holm watching the final assault projections with the calm of a clerk balancing grain stores. The 317th was bleeding out across the inner hive. Its companies were no longer companies. Its platoons were knots of masked survivors attached to whatever officer or watchmaster still transmitted. Its grenadiers were almost gone. Its engineers were beneath the cathedral, where the map showed them as intermittent runes flickering in static. Its tanks burned in the streets while replacement crews climbed into hulls still slick with the last crew's fluids. Holt stepped beside Holm. The 317th will cease to exist if this continues. Holm did not look away from the map. Likely. You knew that before the order? Correct. You are spending the entire regiment. Yes. Holt's hand closed around the edge of the plotting table. Regiments take time to raise. Training, equipment, transport, integration. Even Krieg cannot manufacture veterans out of ash and slogans. Holm turned his mask toward him. Regiments are raised to die correctly, not to be preserved incorrectly. That is not command. That is burial. It is both. Holt stared at him, and there, at last, something within the colonel's posture made sense. Holm was not standing behind the death of his men, he was standing inside it. If ordered, he would walk into the same breach, under the same fire, with the same absence of complaint. He was not asking men to endure anything he believed beneath himself. Krieg officers did not stand apart from expenditure. They merely had the burden of assigning its direction. Holt understood then, and the understanding did not comfort him. The macro-vault-loading shrine opened before Cord in red light and machine thunder. The chamber was vast enough to hold a cathedral within it, and perhaps it did. Pillars of iron and bone supported a ceiling lost in smoke. Conveyor belts dragged demon shells toward launch cradles, each shell swollen with black slurry and bound in brass ribs that twitched like cages around living things. Corpses moved along overhead hooks, their blood draining into feed tanks that pulsed in time with the backward high Gothic chant echoing from hidden vox organs. The floor was engraved with targeting circles. The walls were lined with cogitators screaming through corrupted speakers. At the far end of the shrine, orbital-capable delivery rails angled upward into a sealed launch throat. At the center stood Warpsmith Graxel Vaughn. He was a fortress wearing the shape of a warrior. Black iron plate encased him, marked with hazard stripes, kill tallies, and molten runes. Servo arms rose from his back like the legs of a hunting spider, each ending in tools, claws, injectors, and weapon barrels. A furnace glow burned behind his helm grille. Cables ran from his armor into the loading shrine, into the shell cradles, into the cogitator banks, into the living prisoners wired along the walls. He did not command the machine by voice. He was inside its obedience. Engine seer Lutheran 9 entered through a side gantry with Skitari remnants and saw the Warpsmith. For a moment, no one fired. Lutheran's mechadendrites lifted in rigid horror. Abomination engine! Heertech sovereign contamination! Machine spirits enslaved beyond supplication! Vaughn turned his helm. His voice rolled from the speakers of the shrine and the grill of his armor at once. The Korps Empire arrives with shovels and ledgers. Good. I required more bodies for the launch. Cord raised his lasgun and fired. Others followed. Las beams struck Vaughn's armor and scored bright lines across black ceramite. The Warpsmith did not move. A servo arm answered with a stream of shells that cut the plasma gunner apart from shoulder to hip. Another arm fired a melter pulse that vaporized a Skitari where he stood. The shrine filled with gunfire. They could not kill him directly. Cord knew it within seconds. The Warpsmith was too armored, too integrated, too central to the shrine. Every wound they opened was sealed by cables and crawling repair arms. Every step toward him cost men. Lutheran 9 unleashed a burst of machine cant that made 3 cogitators explode, but Vaughn answered with corrupted scrap code that drove one servitor to tear its own head apart. Krieg did what Krieg had always done when the enemy was too strong. It pinned him in place. Cord sent the flamer left, not to kill Vaughn, but to burn the prisoners wired into one bank of recoil stabilizers. The engineer with the last melter charge went right, crawling beneath a conveyor belt while shells rolled overhead. Rauk fired into exposed cables when they twitched toward the wounded. Lutheran 9 locked his mechadendrites into a control shrine and screamed binary through sparking teeth as he forced the launch rails to pause. Vaughn took one step toward Cord, then another. Each step cracked the floor. Cord backed toward a targeting circle carved into the metal beneath the central loading crane. He saw the rune pattern, he saw the ammunition magazine stacks, he saw the demolition charges already placed by the engineers, he saw the ceiling vents leading upward through Hive Morn's wounded heart. He saw the only calculation that mattered. He took the field vox from the dead carrier. Capel, he said. Static answered. Capel, he repeated. Blood filled his mouth behind the mask. The Master of Ordnance replied through interference. Receiving. State correction. Macro vault loading shrine located. Warpsmith present. Orbital launch rails active. Coordinates transmitting by interior beacon. Fire on position. Capel's bunker fell silent. For the first time in the campaign, his voice did not answer at once. The coordinates placed the strike beneath the assault spearhead. The shelling would not only kill Cord's remnant, it would kill the engineers, the Skitari, the Krieg formations breaching above, the Gorgons in the cathedral approach, perhaps the last living core of the 317th. It would ignite stored munitions whose blast could tear Hive Morn open from beneath and consume everything already committed to the breach. Capel looked at the slate. His fingers hovered over the firing rune. In the command ruin, Var received the same coordinates. Holt heard them. Holm heard them. The map showed the assault spearhead overlapping the requested strike zone like a vein laid across a blade. Capel's voice came through the command vox, flat but changed by the smallest fracture. Fire mission will annihilate assault elements, Var answered. Confirmed. Friendly forces remain within target volume. Confirmed. A pause. Holt looked at Var, then at the map, then at the runes that represented men still alive only because they had not yet been ordered dead. Var gave the order. Fire! Holt closed his eyes, then opened them. Fire! He repeated. Capel's hand fell. The guns spoke. Earthshakers, Medusas, siege mortars, demolishers firing through broken avenues, charges buried under vault foundations, Hades demolition, packs, and internal magazine stacks all became one act of destruction. Above the shrine, artillery punched down through Hive Morn's broken cathedral district. Beneath it, engineers triggered every charge they had left. Lutheran 9 overloaded the launch rails with a Binharic howl. Cord held the targeting beacon against his chest as Vaughn came for him through the smoke. The warpsmith reached him just as the first shell struck the vault ceiling. The world became impact. The macro vault did not explode at once. It convulsed. The ceiling split, raining iron, stone, saints, chains, corpses, and burning glass. Shell stacks detonated in sympathetic thunder. Demon munitions ruptured and released black light that was immediately swallowed by fire. Conveyor belts snapped and whipped through the chamber, flinging bodies like wet parchment. The launch rails buckled. The shrine floor opened. Vaughn raised his servo arms as if to hold up his own fortress. For a heartbeat, he almost did. Then the internal magazine below him detonated. The blast tore Hivemorn open from beneath. Fire, shells, demon matter, brass ribs, human remains, machine oil, broken cogitators, and fragments of the cathedral's foundations vomited into the sky. The central shrine lifted, cracked, and collapsed inward. Vaughn disappeared beneath the weight of the fortress he had made, buried in iron and stone, crushed under his own siege engine as it died screaming around him. Cord survived long enough to see the vault ceiling split fully open. Through the wound above, he saw a piece of Hirkan's poisoned sky. It was red with fire. Black shapes fell through it. Perhaps they were stones, perhaps men, perhaps demons dying in reverse. His hearing was gone. His body had become distant, a broken tool still reporting pain from places no longer attached. The targeting beacon lay crushed against his chest. His left hand was gone past the wrist now. His leg was pinned under something too heavy to move. His mask was cracked, but the filter still rasped. Rauk found him beneath the rubble. The quartermaster crawled through dust and falling ash, dragging himself by one arm. His coat was torn open. One lens had gone dark. He still had his pistol. He always had his pistol. He knelt beside Cord and looked him over with the same calm he had given every wounded man since the first trench. Cord's voice came faintly through the broken grille. Objective! Rauk turned his head toward the ruined shrine, the shattered launch rails, the burning remains of the macro vault. Taken. Cord was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Then I am surplus." Rauk drew his pistol and raised it toward the cracked mask of the Watchmaster. Hive Morn fell silent by degrees. The guns stopped first, though their ghosts remained in the bones of the city. Long after the last shell had fallen, men still felt the tremor of bombardment in their teeth. The collapsed streets settled with slow groans. Ferrocrete slabs cracked under their own weight. Burning manufactoria exhaled black columns into the ruined sky. Tank engines ticked as they cooled in avenues choked with ash and liquefied flesh. Somewhere beneath the cathedral district, ammunition cooked off in muffled bursts, like a heart refusing to understand that it had died. The Krieg had won. The armory world was reclaimed. Nothing living in Hive Morn was whole. The cathedral bastion of St. Drusus Reforged had split from nave to foundation. Its spires leaned inward over the crater where the macro vault had ruptured. The stained glass windows had melted into rivers of coloured slag that ran across the steps and hardened around bones. The great bells lay broken in the plaza, half buried in rubble and corpse slurry. Chains still hung from the transit rails, but the conveyor belts had stopped. Corpses dangled above the streets, swaying in the heat wind, their hooks creaking softly as if the dead were whispering among themselves. In the breach where Objective Mortis had stood, corpsmen moved through the ash with flame units and marking poles. They did not celebrate. They did not cheer victory. Victory was a designation applied after resistance ended. It did not alter the work. There were bodies to sort, weapons to reclaim, contamination zones to burn, and surviving enemies to discover before those enemies discovered strength enough to become inconvenient. Traitor militia were dragged from cellars, sump tunnels, shrine, vaults, and collapsed hab chambers. Those who still carried weapons were shot. Those who surrendered were bound, scanned, and sorted. Some were marked for interrogation. Most were marked for penal labor. A few split open during processing and birthed crawling warp things that had hidden behind their ribs. Those incidents justified the flamers already waiting. The Inquisition arrived before the fires died. Their landers descended into the reclaimed inner hive beneath escorting Valkyries and gun servitors. Black-robed savants, stormtroopers in sealed carapace, sanctioned interrogators, and masked adepts moved through the ruins with warding chains, purity seals, and instruments that shrieked when pointed toward the Macrovault crater. They were followed by the Adeptus Mechanicus, whose priests came with data reliquaries, rad counters, gene scrubbers, machine exorcism engines, and cherubim-bearing incense burners filled with compounds too bitter for human lungs. Their verdict was not long in coming. Hircan Secundus was restored to imperial control. Hircan Secundus was also condemned in part. The Macrovault corruption had spread through too many foundations, too many pipe systems, too many munitions lines, too many machine spirits taught to chant backward in the dark. Large portions of Hivemorn were declared unusable. Several armory districts were declared spiritually compromised beyond economic recovery. The central shell vaults were sealed for Mechanicus purgation or future demolition. The Cathedral District was placed under inquisitorial interdiction. Any civilian recovered within 3 kilometers of the vault rupture was to be screened, restrained, and retained until death or clearance, whichever came first. Clearance was expected to be rare. Lord Marshal Othmar Var received the decrees in a command post made from the remains of a Manufactorum counting house. Half the roof was missing. The walls were black with smoke. The floor still bore the white outlines of bodies removed by quartermaster teams. Around him, scribes tallied the cost of victory, while Vox operators relayed pacification orders across the surviving hives. The 910th Krieg siege army had lost regiments. Not men, regiments. Some formations existed only as parchment now, their banners recovered but their bodies gone. Some were merged into others without ceremony. The survivors of the 317th were folded into the remains of the 412th and 809th, then marked for later reconstitution if replacement tithes and equipment became available. Several bombardment companies had lost their guns, their crews, and the men trained to replace both. A Death Rider formation had returned with more saddles than riders and more dead mounts than living ones. Engineer cadres were reduced to specialists whose designations were now more valuable than their remaining blood. A scribe read the summary aloud. Multiple regiments rendered ineffective for independent deployment. Siege army combat capacity reduced but operational. Redeployment possible after consolidation. Var accepted this with a nod. Consolidate. That was the funeral. Commissar Severian Holt wrote his final report beside a broken window overlooking the cratered approach to Hivemorn. He wrote by the light of fires that would burn until the promethium reservoirs beneath the city exhausted themselves. His coat was patched. His left hand shook when not clenched. His bolt pistol lay on the desk beside him, cleaned, loaded, and heavier than it had been when the campaign began. He had arrived on Hircan Secundus believing he understood the Astra Militarum. He had known courage. He had known cowardice. He had known faith used properly and faith abused until it became treason. He had known men who needed execution to stand and men who needed praise to advance. Krieg had shown him a third thing, men who needed neither. His pen scratched across the parchment. The death corps remain unsuitable for humane command, but ideal for wars where humanity itself has become irrelevant. He paused, listening to a distant wall collapse somewhere in the city. Then he continued. Their deployment is not recommended for pacification actions requiring preservation of civilian morale, local compliance, or symbolic restoration. Their deployment is strongly recommended for siege theaters, contaminated war zones, fortress reductions, attritional fronts, and circumstances in which imperial victory requires the systematic destruction of enemy capacity regardless of sympathetic loss. He nearly wrote monsters. He did not. That word belonged to sermons and frightened men. It was too small, too emotional, too easy. The Death Corps were not monsters. Monsters indulged themselves. Monsters raged. Monsters hungered. The Krieg merely continued. That was worse, and that was why they had won. He added the final recommendation: redeployment advised. Not censure, not commendation, not preservation. Redeployment. Var's orders for Hyrcan were issued before the ink dried. The surviving manufactoria were to be stripped of usable material under Mechanicus supervision. Anything with uncertain machine purity was to be quarantined or destroyed. Contaminated districts were to be burned block by block, cellar by cellar, sump by sump. Loyalist survivors were to be screened by inquisitorial authority, then assigned to reconstruction labor, if cleared. Suspect populations were to be collared and sent into penal work gangs until death, confession, or proven utility. Food stores were to be seized and redistributed according to labor value and contamination grade. All devotional centers touched by Van's heresy were to be demolished unless needed as temporary prisons. Hyrcan was not comforted. Hyrcan was processed. A surviving imperial official was brought before Var in the ruins of the governor's armory hall. The man had been a sub-minister once, or a hive magistrate, or some other functionary important enough to own a clean coat before the rebellion and fortunate enough to survive it stained. He had one eye bandaged and both hands wrapped in dirty cloth. He bowed too deeply, trembling with exhaustion and gratitude. "Lord Marshal," he said, voice breaking, "on behalf of the loyal servants of Hyrcan Secundus, I thank you. You saved this world." Var looked at him through the round black lenses of his mask. The hall smelled of old smoke, wet stone, and the chemical tang of cleansing flame. Outside, prisoners were being marched in chains toward labor sorting yards. Beyond them, Krieg flamers burned a Hab district whose inhabitants had failed purity screening. "We did not save it," Var said. "We prevented its usefulness from passing to the enemy." The official's mouth opened. No reply came. Var turned away, the matter complete. In the Korps sorting vault beneath the shattered cathedral approach, Quartermaster Rauch inventoried what remained of Watchmaster Cord. The body had been recovered from the macro vault collapse after 3 days of excavation by servitors and penal laborers. It had no name attached to it beyond designation. Its face, if one remained, was sealed behind a cracked mask and not worth the effort required to see. Rauch had given the Emperor's piece in the vault, as requested, as required, as correct. The pistol mark remained in the respirator casing, neat and black at the center. The inventory mattered more than the man. Damaged Lucius pattern number 98 lasgun. Action fouled but recoverable. Stock cracked. Barrel serviceable after rites of cleaning. Cracked respirator mask. Lens damaged. Filter assembly ruined. Scrap value only. Bayonet. Usable. Edge notched. Return to armory for sharpening. Grenade loops. Empty. Entrenching tool. Missing. Boots. Serviceable after decontamination. Greatcoat. Unsuitable. Burn. Dog tag. Recovered. Designation confirmed. Archive without name. Rauch placed the bayonet in the salvage tray. He set the lasgun aside for repair. He removed the boots with care because good souls were harder to replace than dead men. When the corpse had been stripped of value, it was placed with the rest beneath a chalk mark denoting final disposal. Cord was not granted a monument. He did not require one. His equipment returned to the regiment. His debt continued through the men who would carry what he had carried. Rauch paused only once. He looked at the cracked mask, at the black pistol mark, and at the empty grenade loops. "Spent correctly," he said. Then he moved to the next body. Across Hyrcan Secundus, the war shrank into occupation and burning. Hive Karth's surviving loyalists were found alive in fewer numbers than their distress calls had implied. Their oxygen recyclers had failed before relief came. Those who had endured were pale, silent, and half-mad from breathing emergency, reserves, and corpse air. They thanked the Krieg when the masks appeared in their sealed districts. The Krieg did not answer. Rescue was not the word in the orders. Recovery was. Hive-Morn's dead were too many to bury. They were burned when contaminated, rendered when useful, sealed when inaccessible, and recorded when identifiable. In some avenues, the bodies were built into temporary barricades until corpse carts could reach them. In others, bulldozers pushed them into shell craters and covered them with rubble. Priests came after, blessing mass graves they had not counted and could not comprehend. The ash rain fell over all of it, soft and endless, until the ruins resembled Krieg in miniature. Perhaps that was inevitable. Beyond Hyrcan, the galaxy did not notice. Armageddon still burned beneath its own wars. Vrax remained a name spoken wherever siege masters studied how long faith and artillery could grind against walls before both became indistinguishable from hatred. Orphean war zones called for men who could fight where hope had become strategically irrelevant. Demon fronts opened in forgotten sectors. Xenos incursions swallowed border systems whose names would never reach terror except as delayed losses. Hive sieges began on worlds that had not yet learned they were doomed. Nameless trench fronts waited beneath toxic skies for regiments willing to spend years advancing by meters. The Death Corps were not exceptional because they suffered. All mankind suffered in the 41st millennium. The Death Corps were exceptional because suffering changed nothing in their orders. When the redeployment command came, the surviving regiments marched back to the troop ships through ash rain. There was no parade, no celebration, no medals pinned to coats. Banners were carried because banners were issued. Coffin carts rolled because the dead had weight, and weight required transport. Tanks limped toward landers with armor plates welded over holes. Crews reduced, machine spirits aggrieved and muttering through damaged engines. Death Riders led fewer mounts than they had brought. Engineers carried charges they had not spent. Quartermasters brought salvage. Priests brought smoke. Commissar Holt brought his report. Lord Marshal Var brought the campaign ledger. Hyrcan Secundus burned behind them. Its fires reflected in the lenses of the corpsmen as they filed into the void transports. None turned for a final look unless ordered. The planet had rebelled. The planet had been corrected. Whether it lived afterward was a question for administrators, priests, and machines. Far away beneath the poisoned crust of Krieg, new soldiers were already being prepared. New masks fitted, new lasguns issued. New recruits taught that survival was not the word. New bodies counted toward the next tithe. The dead of Hyrcan had made room in the ledger. Krieg would fill it. In the hold of the troop ship, men stood in silence inside iron racks, while restraints locked across their chests. Some wore coats patched with fabric from dead regiments. Some held weapons that had belonged to men, now ash. Some breathed through replacement filters taken from corpses whose lungs had failed first. They were fewer than before. That did not matter. They were still enough to be spent again. The Vox clicked above them. All elements prepare for translation. Redeployment order received. Destination confirmed. The name of the next war zone followed, flat and holy through the static. The transports turned from Hyrcan Secundus before its fires had died. In their cargo holds, the corpsmen stood motionless, already dead in every way that mattered, waiting only to be spent.